Story of a child neurosis. Case of the man of the wolves. Sigmund Freud. Story of a child neurosis. Case of the man of the wolves. 1. Preliminary remarks. The clinical case that we are about to present, although again only fragmentarily, is characterized by a whole series of particularities that we will have to examine beforehand. It is about a young man who fell ill at the age of 18, immediately after a gonorrhea infection, and who, several years later, was subjected to psychoanalytic treatment, showing himself to be totally incapacitated. During the 10 years prior to his illness, his life had been approximately normal and he had completed his secondary school studies without major disruption. But his childhood had been dominated by a severe neurotic disturbance that began in him shortly before he was 4 years old as anxiety hysteria, zoophobia, later transformed into an obsessional neurosis with a religious content, and with its ramifications reached as far as the 10 years of the subject. In the present essay we will deal only with this infantile neurosis. Despite having been expressly authorized by the patient, we have refused to publish the complete history of his illness, his treatment, and his cure, considering it technically unrealizable and inadmissible from the social point of view. This also eliminates any possibility of showing the connection of his childhood illness with his later definitive ailment, about which we can only indicate that the subject spent entire years in German sanatoriums because of it, in which his state was described as insanity. Manic depressive. This diagnosis would have been accurate applied to the patient's father, whose intensely active life had to be disturbed by repeated bouts of severe depression. But in the son it was not possible for me to observe, in several years of treatment, any change of state of mind that due to its intensity or the conditions of its appearance could justify it. In my opinion, this case, like many others variously diagnosed by clinical psychiatry, must be considered as a subsequent state of an obsessive neurosis that spontaneously led to incomplete cure. My exposition will refer, therefore, only to an infantile neurosis analyzed not during its course, but 15 years later, a circumstance that has its advantages and disadvantages. The analysis carried out on the infantile neurotic subject will, of course, appear more trustworthy, but it cannot be very rich in content. We have to give the child too many words and too many thoughts, in spite of which we will perhaps not be able to make the conscience penetrate to the deepest psychic strata. The analysis of a childhood disease by means of the memory that the adult and intellectually mature subject retains of it no longer presents such limitations, but we will have to take into account the deformation and rectification that the past itself undergoes when being contemplated from later years. The first case perhaps provides more convenient results, but the second is much more instructive. In any case, we can affirm that the analyses of infantile neuroses integrate a high theoretical interest. They contribute to an exact understanding of neuroses of adults, as well as children's dreams, to the interpretation of the subsequent dreams. But not because they are more transparent or poorer in elements. The difficulty of infusing the mental life of the child makes them an arduous task for the doctor. But the lack of subsequent stratifications allows the essentials of the neurosis to be transparent without difficulty. The resistance against the results of psychoanalysis has now taken a new form. Until now our adversaries have been content to deny the reality of the facts affirmed by the analysis, of course without taking the trouble to verify it. This procedure now seems to be slowly running out of steam. And it is replaced by that of acknowledging the facts, but interpreting them in such a way as to suppress the conclusions that are deduced from them, thus avoiding once more the novelties against which the resistance is raised. But the study of infantile neuroses proves the futility of such attempts at tendentious interpretation. It shows the predominant participation of the libidinal instinctual forces, much discussed, in the structuring of the neurosis, and reveals the absence of remote cultural tendencies, of which the child does not yet know anything and which, therefore, can mean nothing for him. Another feature that recommends our attention to the analysis that we are going to present here is related to the severity of the ailment and the duration of its treatment. Analyses that achieve a favorable outcome in a short time can be very flattering for the therapist's self-respect and clearly demonstrate the therapeutic importance of psychoanalysis, but, on the other hand, they do not favor in any way the progress of our scientific knowledge, since they teach us nothing new. They have led us so quickly to a favorable result because we already knew in advance what was necessary to do to achieve it. Only those analyses that present us with special difficulties and which take us a long time to carry out can teach us something new. Only in these cases can we descend to the deepest and most primitive strata of mental evolution and extract from them the solution to the problems posed by subsequent structures. We then say to ourselves that only those analyses that penetrate so deeply deserve the name of such. Of course, his one case does not instruct us on everything we would like to know. Or rather, it could instruct us on all of it if it were possible for us to apprehend everything, without the limitation of our own perception forcing us to be content with little. The present case left nothing to be desired in terms of such fruitful difficulties. The first years of treatment hardly achieved any change. A fortunate constellation allowed, however, that all external circumstances made it possible to continue the therapeutic attempt. In less favorable circumstances it would have been necessary to discontinue treatment after some time. As for the doctor's attitude, I can only say that in such cases he must remain as detached from time as the unconscious is and know how to renounce any immediate therapeutic effect if he wants to discover and achieve something positively. Likewise, few cases require such patience, docility, understanding, and trust from the patient and their relatives. For the analyst it must be said that the results achieved after such long work in one of these cases will allow him to essentially shorten the duration of another subsequent treatment of a similarly serious case and thus gradually master, after having submitted to it once, the indifference of the unconscious regarding time. The patient we are about to treat remained for a long time entrenched in an attitude of indifferent docility. He listened and understood, but he was not interested in anything. His clear intelligence was as if kidnapped by the instinctive forces that governed his behavior in the little external life of which he was still capable. A long education was necessary to move him to participate independently in analytic work, and when the first liberations arose as a result of this effort, he completely diverted his attention from the task in order to avoid further modifications and to remain comfortably in the situation created. Her fear of an independent and responsible existence was so great that it made up for all the inconvenience of her illness. We only find a way to master it. I had to wait until the link to my person. It became intense enough to make up for it, and so I played this factor against the other. I decided, not without first calculating the opportunity, that the treatment had to end within a certain period of time, whatever phase it had reached. I was determined to strictly observe this deadline, and the patient eventually realized the seriousness of my purpose. Under the inexorable pressure of such pressure, his resistance and his fixation to the disease gave way, and the analysis then provided, in a disproportionately short period of time, all the material that allowed the solution of his inhibitions and the suppression of his symptoms. From this last period of analysis, in which resistance temporarily disappeared and the patient produced the impression of a lucidity that is generally achieved only in hypnosis, come all the clarifications that enabled me to understand his infantile neurosis. Thus the course of treatment illustrated the principle long laid down in analytic technique, that the length of the path that analysis has to take with the patient and the magnitude of the material that has to be mastered by this path do not mean much thing in comparison with the resistance that will arise during such work, and they have to be taken into account only insofar as they are proportional to it. This is what happens now, in wartime, when an army needs entire weeks and months to advance a distance that in peacetime can be covered in a few hours by train, and that a short time before has actually been covered by the opposing army in a few days. A third peculiarity of the analysis that we propose to present here has also considerably hampered my decision to publish it. Their results have either matched or linked perfectly to our prior knowledge. But some details have seemed so singular and implausible to me that I have had scruples about demanding their admission from others. Consequently, I have invited the patient to subject his memories to a severe critique, but for his part he found nothing implausible in them. Readers can at least be sure that I only present what arose before me as an independent experience and not influenced by my expectations. Therefore, I can only refer to the wise affirmation that between heaven and earth there are many more things than our philosophy supposes. Whoever knew how to exclude his own convictions even more fundamentally would surely discover more. 2. General exposure of the patient's environment and clinical history. It is not possible for me to present my patient's history in a purely historical way, nor in a purely pragmatic way. I cannot exclusively develop a history of the treatment or a history of the disease, but I am forced to combine both with each other. As is well known, we have not yet found any means by which the exposition of an analysis reflects and leads the reader's mind to the conviction resulting from it. Nor would a detailed record of the course of the treatment session solve such a problem, and, moreover, the psychoanalytic technique precludes writing it before the patient. Consequently, we do not publish these analyses to convince those who up to now have been opposed to our theories, but to provide new data for those researchers who have already been convinced by direct work with patients. I will begin by describing the environment in which the subject lived as a child and communicating that part of his childhood history that I was given to find out from the beginning without great risk and that later did not achieve any complement or clarification for several years. His parents had married young and were happy until illness began to overshadow their lives, as the mother contracted an abdominal condition, and the father began to suffer bouts of depression that forced him to leave the family home. The psychic quality of the paternal ailment meant that the subject did not become aware of it until much later. On the other hand, his mother's poor state of health, which prevented her from taking care of her children assiduously, was revealed to him at a very early age. One day, surely before she was 4 years old, she heard her complaining to the doctor about her ailments, and her words were so impressed on her that many years later she repeated them literally, applying them to her own disorders. He was not an only child, as he had a precociously intelligent and perverse sister 2 years older than him, who played a very important role in his life. For his part, he was entrusted to the care of a nanny, a woman from the town, already old and not very educated, who devoted him indefatigable tenderness, since he was for her the substitute for a son she had lost at an early age. The family lived on one farm during the winter and spent the summers on another. The day his parents sold the 2 farms and moved to the nearby city, both divided the subject's childhood into 2 periods. During the first year, different relatives used to spend long periods of time with them on one of the farms, the father's brothers, the mother's sisters, with their children, and the maternal grandparents. During the summer, his parents used to be away for a few weeks. A cover memory showed him standing by his nursemaid watching the carriage drive away with his parents and sister, then calmly returning home when the carriage was out of sight. At the time of this memory he must have been still very small. The following summer, their parents also left their sister at home and took an English governess, to whom they entrusted the guardianship of both children. In later years, his relatives told him many details of his childhood, of which he already spontaneously remembered some, although he could not place them on specific or related dates. One of these memories, repeatedly evoked by his relatives on the occasion of his later illness, already makes us aware of the problem, the solution of which we will have to deal with. According to him, the subject had initially been a mild and docile child, to the point that his family said that he must have been the girl and his older sister the boy. But when his parents returned from one of their summer excursions, they found him completely changed. He was discontented, excitable, and angry, everything irritated him, and in such cases he would scream and kick wildly. This happened in that same summer in which the children were entrusted to the English governess, who proved to be an arbitrary and insufferable woman and, moreover, fond of drink. Consequently, the mother was inclined to attribute to her influence the alteration of her son's character, supposing that the way in which she had treated him was the cause of her excitement. The maternal grandmother, who had spent the summer with the children, opined, on the other hand, with greater clairvoyance, that her grandson's irritability had been caused by the disagreement that had arisen between the Englishwoman and the nanny, since the governess had insulted her several times. The old maid, calling her a witch, and had repeatedly thrown her out of the room where the children were. In these scenes, the boy had always sided with his beloved maiden and had shown his hatred of the governess. Consequently, the Englishwoman was fired shortly after her parents returned, but his disappearance no longer altered the boy's excitement. The patient retains the memory of this thankless time. He affirms that the first of those fits of anger arose in him for not having received double gifts on Christmas Eve, which was also his birthday. His demands and his unbearable susceptibility did not even forgive his maid, whom he perhaps tormented more than anyone else. But this phase of alteration of his character appears indissolubly linked in his memories with many other unique and morbid phenomena that he is unable to order chronologically. In this way, he confuses all the facts presented below, which could not have been simultaneous and are, moreover, contradictory in a single and unique period, that of when he was still on the first farm, from which, as he believes, little emerged. After he was 5 years old. Thus, he recounts having suffered intense fears at that time, which his sister took advantage of to torment him. There was a book of pictures in the house, one of which represented a wolf walking on 2 feet. When the boy saw that picture, he began to scream, maddened by the fear that the wolf would go to him and eat him, and the sister knew how to manage so that he found it at every step, rejoicing in his terror. Also other big and small animals scared him. Once he was running after a yellow butterfly, trying to catch it, undoubtedly it was a Schwalbenschwanz, when, suddenly, an intense fear of that animal seized him and he began to cry, abandoning his pursuit. Beetles and caterpillars also scared and disgusted him. But he remembered at the same time that sometimes he took pleasure in tormenting them, cutting them to pieces. Horses also inspired a certain fear in him. When he saw one of these animals being hit, he would scream in fear, and on one occasion they had to take him out of the circus for this very reason. But other times he was pleased to imagine that he himself was beating a horse. His memory of these events was not accurate enough to allow him to discern whether these contradictory patterns of his behavior towards animals were really simultaneous or successively substituted for each other and in what order. Nor could he say whether this period of excitement was replaced by a phase of illness or continued through the latter. In any case, the confessions that follow justify the hypothesis that in those years he suffered from an obvious obsessive neurosis. He recounted, in fact, that for a long period he had shown himself to be extraordinarily pious. Before going to sleep he had to pray for a long time and cross himself numerous times, and many nights he would go around the bedroom with a chair, on which he would climb to devoutly kiss all the religious images that hung on the walls. With this pious ceremonial it did not harmonize at all, or perhaps it harmonized very well another memory referring to the same period, according to which he often indulged in blasphemous thoughts that arose in his imagination as if inspired by the devil. Thus, when he thought of God, he automatically associated the words filthy or garbage with such a concept. During a trip to a German spa, he was tormented by the obsession of thinking about the Holy Trinity every time he saw 3 piles of horse dung or any other rubbish on the road. At that time he also carried out a singular ceremonial when he saw people who inspired him compassion, beggars, invalids, and old people. On such occasions he had to exhale noisily, with which he believed he was conjuring up the possibility of seeing himself one day like them, or, in other circumstances, retaining his breath for as long as possible. Naturally, I was inclined to suppose that these symptoms, clearly corresponding to an obsessional neurosis, belonged to a period and to a later evolutionary level than fear and cruelties against animals. The patient's later years were characterized by a profound alteration in his affective relationships with his father, who, after repeated bouts of depression, found it impossible to hide the pathological aspects of his character. In the early years of his childhood such relationships had been, on the other hand, extraordinarily affectionate, and this was clearly remembered by the boy. His father loved him very much and liked to play with him, who for his part felt proud of his father and expressed his desire to one day become a gentleman like his father. The maid had told him that his sister belonged only to his mother, and, instead, he only belonged to his father, a revelation that filled him with joy. But at the end of her childhood, the emotional ties that united her father disappeared almost completely, as it irritated and saddened her to see him clearly prefer her sister. Subsequently, their filial relationship was governed by the fear of the father as the dominant factor. Around the age of 8, all the phenomena that the patient integrated in that phase of his life, which began with the alteration of his character, disappeared. They did not disappear abruptly, but became more and more spaced out, until they completely vanished, a process that the subject attributes to the influence of the teachers and tutors who replaced his female servitude. We see, then, that the problems whose solution is posed in this case to the analysis are, broadly speaking, those of discovering where the sudden alteration of the child's character came from, what significance his phobia and his perversities had, how he arrived at his religiosity. Obsessive, and what is the relationship that links all these phenomena. I will recall again that our therapeutic work was directly concerned with a later recent neurotic illness, and that it was only possible to obtain any information about those earlier problems when the course of the analysis distracted us for a time from the present, forcing us to take a detour through the subject's childhood history. 3. Seduction and its immediate consequences. Our first suspicions were directed, as was natural, towards the English governess, during whose stay at the estate the alteration of the character of the child had arisen. The subject communicated 2 screen memories, incomprehensible in itself, that referred to her. Such recollections were as follows: on one occasion when the governess was preceding them, she had turned to them and said, "Look at my little tail." And once again, going by car, the wind had snatched his hat, to the maximum delight of the 2 brothers. Both memories alluded to the castration complex and allowed us to risk the hypothesis that a threat addressed to the boy by the governess would have contributed considerably to the genesis of his later abnormal behavior. It is not at all dangerous to communicate such constructions to the analysans, because even if they are erroneous they do not harm the analysis at all, and of course we only communicate them when they integrate a possibility of approximation to reality. The immediate effect of the communication of this hypothesis were a few dreams, the full interpretation of which we were not able to reach, but which all seemed to develop around the same content. They dealt, insofar as it was possible to understand them, with aggressive acts of the child against his sister or against the governess, and with vigorous scolding and punishments received as a result of such aggressions. As if he had wanted, after the bath, to undress his sister, to remove her wrappings, or her veils, or something similar. It was not possible for us to unravel with certainty the content of these dreams, but the impression that the same material was always elaborated in them in different ways revealed to us the true condition of the supposed reminiscences integrated in them. Could not be treated. Rather than fantasies imagined by the subject about his childhood, probably during puberty, and which had now reappeared in a hardly recognizable form. Its significance was later revealed to us, all at once, when the patient suddenly remembered that, while still very young and still on the first farm, his sister had induced him to perform acts of a sexual nature. First came the memory that, when they were together in the toilet, she invited him to show her bottom to each other, she doing it first, and soon after the essential scene of seduction appeared with all its details of time and place. It was in spring and during an absence of the father. The children played, on the floor, in a room next to their mother's. The sister had then taken his member and had played with it while she told him, as if to justify her conduct, that the girl did the same thing with everyone, for example, with the gardener, whom he placed upside down and then took his genitals. Such facts make it easier for us to understand the fantasies previously deduced. Were destined to erase from the subject's memory an event that would later seem unpleasant to his masculine self-esteem, and they achieved this end, substituting the historical truth for an antithetical desire. According to these fantasies, he had not played the passive role with his sister, but rather, on the contrary, he had shown himself aggressive, wanting to see his sister naked, and being rejected and punished, which had provoked those fits of anger in him, of which the family tradition spoke so much. It is also very appropriate to weave into these fantasies the governess, to whom the main blame for her fits of anger had been attributed by the mother and grandmother. Such fantasies, then, corresponded exactly to those legends with which an afterwardly great and proud nation tries to cover up the pettiness of its principles. In reality, the governess could not have had more than a very remote part in the seduction and its consequences. The scenes with the sister took place during the spring immediately before the summer, during which the children were entrusted to the care of the Englishwomen. The boys' hostility against the governess arose rather in another way. By insulting the nanny by calling her a witch, the governess was equated, in the subject's mind, with her own sister, who had been the first to tell him monstrous and incredible things about her beloved maiden, and such equating allowed her to externalize against the Englishwomen the hostility which, as we shall see later, had developed in him against his sister as a result of the seduction. I will now briefly interrupt my patient's childhood history to examine his sister's personality, her evolution and subsequent destinies, and the influence she exerted on him. He was 2 years older than him and always preceded him in the course of intellectual development. After an untamed and markedly masculine childhood, his intelligence made rapid and brilliant progress, distinguished by his penetration and his precise vision of reality. During his studies he showed a predilection for the natural sciences, but he also composed poems that his father judged excellent. Far superior in intelligence to her numerous suitors, she used to make fun of them and never took any of them seriously. But as soon as she turned 20, she began to show signs of depression, lamenting that she was not pretty enough, and ended up completely avoiding social contact. On her return from a trip in the company of a lady friend of the family, she recounted absolutely implausible things, such as having been mistreated by her companion, but, nevertheless, she remained effectively attached to her. Shortly after, on a second trip, he was poisoned and died far from his home. His condition probably corresponded to the onset of early dementia. We see in it a testimony of the evident neuropathic heredity of the family, and certainly not the only one. An uncle of his father's brother, died after long years of an extravagant life, from the details of which it could be deduced that he suffered from severe obsessional neurosis. And many of his collateral relatives showed and show less severe nervous disorders. For our patient, his sister was throughout his childhood, leaving aside the fact of sexual initiation, a dangerous competitor in the esteem of his parents, and her relentlessly displayed superiority continually weighed him down with her weight. Above all, he envied her the admiration his father showed for her great ability, while he, intellectually inhibited by his obsessional neurosis, had to content himself with a much more lukewarm estimate. From the age of 14 the relations of both brothers began to improve, since their similar spiritual disposition and their common opposition against their parents ended up establishing an affectionate camaraderie between them. In the stormy sexual excitement of his puberty, the subject attempted to approach his sister physically, and when she had rejected him as decisively as skillfully, he turned at once to a farm girl who served in the household and bore the same name as his sister. With this, he took a decisive step for his heterosexual choice of object, since all the girls with whom he later fell in love, with evident signs of obsession many times, were also servants whose enlightenment and intelligence had to be much lower than his. Now then, if all these erotic objects were substitutes for his sister, who had not been achieved, we must recognize as a decisive factor in his choice of object a tendency to lower his sister and to suppress that intellectual superiority of his, which had tormented him so much for a period of time of their life. Alfredo Adler has also subordinated, like everything else, the sexual conduct of men to motives of this kind, born of the will to power of the individual's instinct for affirmation. Without going so far as to deny the importance of such motives of power and privilege, I have also never been able to convince myself that they can play the dominant and exclusive role that is attributed to them. If I had not carried out the analysis of my patient to the end, the observation of this case would have forced me to rectify such prejudices in the sense advocated by Adler. By the end of this analysis he brought with him, unexpectedly, new material, from which it turned out once again that the motives of power, in our case the tendency to debasement, had only determined the choice of object in the sense of a contribution and a rationalization, insofar as that true and deepest determination enabled me to maintain my previous convictions. The patient stated that when he received the news of his sister's death there was no experienced the least pain. Inwardly imposing outward signs of mourning, he coldly rejoiced at having become sole heir to the family fortune. By this time he had already been ill for several years with his recent neurosis. But I confess that this information made me hesitate for a long time in diagnosing the case. It was to be expected, of course, that the pain produced by the loss of the most beloved person in his family would be inhibited in its externalization by the continued effect of the jealousy that she inspired in him and by the intervention of his incestuous, repressed and unconscious crush. But I was not resigned to giving up finding a substitute for the inhibited explosion of pain. Finally we found it in an effective manifestation that the subject had not been able to explain. A few months after the death of his sister, he made a trip to the city where she had died, looked in the cemetery for the tomb of a great poet who at that time embodied his ideal, and shed bitter tears over it. He himself was surprised and he was disconcerted by this reaction, since he knew that more than a century had passed since the death of that poet he venerated, and he only understood it when he remembered that his father used to compare the poems of his dead sister with those of that great poet. An error made by the subject in his subsequent communications now made it easier for me to interpret that pious act apparently dedicated to the poet. He had stated, in fact, several times that his sister had shot herself, and later had to correct himself by saying that it was more true that she had poisoned herself. Now then, the poet wept had died in a challenge with a pistol. Pushkin, according to Strachey. I return now to the story of the brother, which from here on I will have to present in a more pragmatic way. We were able to establish precisely that the subject's age when his sister began her sexual initiation was 3 years and 3 months. The scenes described took place, as we have already said, in the spring of that same year in which the parents, upon returning from their summer trip in autumn, found the child completely transformed. We shall therefore be inclined to relate this transformation to the awakening of his sexual activity, which occurred in the interval. How did the boy react to his older sister's seduction? With a decided rejection, as we already know, but such rejection referred only to the person and not to the thing. He did not like his sister as a sexual object, probably because his attitude towards her was already determined in a hostile sense by his competence in parental affection. He avoided, therefore, his attempts at sexual approximation, which did not take long to cease completely. But, instead, he tried to substitute his sister for another more beloved person, and the revelations of the former, who had tried to justify his actions with the supposed example of the girl, directed his choice towards the latter. Consequently, he began to play with his member in front of the girl, behavior in which we must see an attempt at seduction, as in most of those cases in which children do not hide their onanism. But the girl disappointed him, putting on a serious face and declaring that this was not right and that the children who did it stayed in that place for a while. Wound. The effects of this revelation, tantamount to a threat of castration, worked in many directions, in which we will have to follow its tracks. In the first place, his love for the cha-cha was dealt a severe blow by this. At the very moment of his disappointment he did not seem angry with her, but later, when his rages began, it was shown that he held a grudge against him. Now then, one of the characteristic features of his behavior consisted in the fact that before abandoning a location of his libido, impossible to sustain any longer, he always tenaciously defended it, and so, when the governess appeared on the scene and insulted the maid, throwing her out of the room and wanting to destroy her authority, the subject exaggerated his affection for the insulted woman and showed his deviation and anger against the Englishwoman. But, anyway, he began to secretly search for another sexual object. Seduction had given her the passive sexual purpose of having her genitals touched. Later we will see who he wanted to get it from and what paths led him to such a choice. As expected, his first sexual arousals launched his sexual investigation. And it did not take long for the problem of castration to arise. Around this time, he was able to observe two girls, his sister and one of his friends, while they were urinating. His natural insight should have made him deduce from this visual perception the true state of affairs, but, instead of this, he behaved in that way that is already known to us from the analysis of other children. He rejected the idea that such a perception confirmed the words of the maid regarding the wound and explained it to her by telling her that it was the rear in front of the girls. But such an explanation was not enough to remove the subject of castration from his thoughts. Consequently, he continued extracting allusions to that subject from what he heard and saw. For example, when the governess, much given to terrifying fantasies, told him that some candy bars were pieces of the body of a snake, a fact that reminded him of a story of his father, according to which, having found a snake on a walk through the field, he had killed her by cutting her to pieces with his stick, or when they read the story of the wolf who wanted to catch fish in winter using the tail as bait, until it froze and he fell into the water. Thus, the subject of castration was turning over in his thoughts, but he did not yet believe in the possibility of being a victim of it, and, therefore, it did not inspire fear in him. The stories that he came to know at this time raised other sexual problems for him. In Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf and the Seven Little Goats, the children, or the little goats, were taken from the wolf's womb. Consequently, either the wolf belonged to the female sex or the males could also harbor children in the womb. This problem was not solved at that time. In addition, during the period of this sexual investigation, the wolf did not yet inspire fear in her. One of the patient's communications makes it easier for us to understand the change in his character that arose during the absence of his parents and was remotely linked to seduction. He says that after the rebuff and the threat of the cha-cha he abandoned onanism very soon. The sexual life initiated under the direction of the genital zone had thus succumbed to an external inhibition, the influence of which brought it back to an earlier phase corresponding to the pregenital organization. As a consequence of this suppression of onanism, the boy's sexual life took on a sadistic anal character, and the infantile subject became irritable, unbearable, and cruel, satisfying himself in such a way with animals and people. His main object was his beloved girl, whom he knew how to torment until she made her cry, thus taking revenge for the rejection received and simultaneously satisfying her sexual impulses in the manner corresponding to the regressive phase. He began to make cruelty to small animals, catching flies to tear off their wings and trampling beetles, and he delighted in the idea of mistreating larger animals as well, for example, horses. It was, therefore, fully sadistic activities of a positive sign. Later we will talk about the anal impulses corresponding to this time. The analysis was greatly facilitated by the fact that in the patient's memory there also appeared the recollection of certain fantasies corresponding to the same period, but of a totally different kind, in which it was about children who were the object of ill treatment, consisting mainly of hit their penis. The personality of such anonymous objects was clarified by another fantasy in which the heir to the throne was locked in a dungeon and flogged. The heir to the throne was evidently the subject himself. It turned out, then, that in such fantasies our patient's primary sadism had turned against his own person, transforming into masochism. The detail that the blows fell preferentially on the virile member allows us to conclude that an awareness of guilt related to onanism already intervened in such a transformation. The analysis left no doubt that such passive tendencies would appear at the same time as or immediately after the active sadistic ones. This corresponds to the extraordinarily clear, intense, and persistent ambivalence of the patient, which manifested itself here for the first time in the identical development of the pairs of antithetical partial instincts. Said circumstance then continued to be characteristic of the subject, as characteristic as the aforementioned that in reality none of the positions of his libido ever completely disappeared, as different ones arose, but instead, it subsisted alongside them, allowing it a continuous oscillation that proved irreconcilable with the acquisition of a fixed character. The masochistic tendencies of the subject lead us to a different point whose solution we have omitted up to now, since only the analysis of the immediately subsequent phase reveals it to us with full certainty. We said that, after being rejected by the girl, the subject released his libidinous hopes from her and chose another person as a sexual object. Well then, such a person was his father, who was absent at the time. He was surely led to this choice by a coincidence of different factors, many of them accidental, such as the memory of the encounter with the snake, which he had broken into pieces. But above all he renewed with her his first and most primitive choice of object, carried out correlatively to the narcissism of the small child, by way of identification. We have already heard that his father had been his ideal and that, when asked what he wanted to be, he used to answer that a gentleman like his father. This object of identification of his active tendency became, in the sadistic anal phase, the sexual object of a passive tendency. It seems as if the seduction of which his sister had made him the object had imposed on him the passive role and had given him a passive sexual purpose. Under the continued influence of this event, he then followed the path from the sister and passing through the maid to the father, that is, from the passive attitude with respect to the woman to the passive attitude with respect to the man, finding, moreover, in him a link with its previous spontaneous evolutionary phase. The father thus became his object again, identification was replaced, as befitted a higher stage of evolution, by the choice of an object, and the transformation of the active attitude into a passive attitude was the result and the sign of the seduction that occurred in the interval. In the sadistic phase it would not, of course, have been so easy for him to become active with respect to the overbearing father. When the father returned in late summer or early fall, the boy's outbursts found a new purpose. Against the cha-cha they had served active sadistic purposes, against the father they pursued masochistic purposes. Showing off his malice, he forced his father to punish him and hit him, that is, to give him the desired masochistic sexual satisfaction. Thus, his outbursts of anger were nothing more than attempts at seduction. Correlatively to the motivation of masochism, he also found in such punishments the satisfaction of his feeling of guilt. I remember how, in one of those fits of rage, he redoubled his screams when he saw his father approaching. But the father did not hit him, but instead tried to appease him, playing ball with the pillow of his little bed. I don't know how often his parents would have occasion to recall this typical relationship in the face of the child's inexplicable behavior. The child who behaves so wildly confesses quite clearly that he wants to punish himself. He simultaneously seeks in correction the appeasement of his guilty conscience and the satisfaction of his masochistic sexual tendencies. The subsequent clarification of our case we owe to the precise appearance of the memory that all the symptoms of anxiety and fear were added to the character disturbance just after a certain event. Before it the subject had never felt fear, and only after it began to torment him. It was possible to fix the exact date of that change in the days immediately preceding the day on which he turned 4. The childhood period that we have to deal with is thus divided, by this point of reference, into 2 phases, a first period of wickedness and perversity, from the seduction, which occurred when the child was 3 years and 3 months old, until his 4th birthday. And another, successive and longer, in which the signs of neurosis predominate. And the event that allows us to carry out this division is not an external trauma, but a dream from which the subject awoke in anguish. 4. The dream and the primordial scene. I have already published this dream elsewhere, Dreams with Children's Story Themes, 1913, in relation to the amount of material in the derivative of children's stories. I will start by repeating what I wrote on that occasion. I dreamed that it was night and I was lying in my bed had its feet towards the window, through which you could see a row of old walnut trees. I know that when I had this dream it was a winter night. Suddenly the window opens by itself, and I see, with a great start, that in the branches of the thick walnut tree that stands before the window are perched a few white wolves. There were 6 or 7 of them, all white, and they looked more like foxes or cattle dogs, for they had big tails like foxes and pricked up their ears like dogs when they sniff something. Seized with horrible fear, doubtless of being eaten by wolves, I began to scream. And I woke up. My nanny came to see It was passing, and it took me a long time to convince myself that it had only been a dream, so clearly and precisely had I seen the window open and the wolves perched in the tree. At last I calmed down, feeling saved from danger, and went back to sleep. The only movement in the dream was to open the window, for the wolves remained motionless in the branches of the tree, to the right and left of the trunk, and looking at me. It seemed as if all his attention was fixed on me. I think this was my first anxiety dream. By then he would have been 3 or 4 years old, 5 at the most. From tonight until I was 11 or 12 years old I was always afraid of seeing something terrible in a dream. The subject drew the image from his dream exactly as he had described it. The analysis provided us with the following material. The subject has always related this dream to his memory that in those years of his childhood he was intensely afraid of a picture from a storybook in which he saw a wolf. His sister, older than him and with a much more developed intelligence, took pleasure in making him find at every step, and when he least expected it, that picture, before which he began to cry and scream, seized with intense fear. The print represented a wolf walking on 2 feet, with its claws extended forward and its ears pricked. He thinks he remembers that it corresponded to the story of Little Red Hood. Why were the wolves in his dream white? This detail makes you think of the large flocks of sheep that grazed in the meadows near the farm. His father sometimes took him with him when he went to visit these herds, a favor that the little subject was delighted and proud to thank. Later, according to the reports obtained, it could have been a short time before the dream a deadly epizootic broke out among the sheep. The father sent for a disciple of Pasteur, who vaccinated the animals, but they continued to succumb to the disease, despite the vaccine, and in even greater numbers than before it. How do wolves appear up the tree? With this idea the subject associates a story that he had heard his grandfather tell. He doesn't remember if it was before or after his dream, but the content of the story clearly testifies in favor of the former. Such a tale was as follows: a tailor was working in his room, when the window suddenly opened and a wolf entered through it. The tailor struck him with the measuring rod. Or rather corrects. Immediately the patient grabbed him by the tail and yanked it off, thus making the wolf run away in fear. Days later, when the tailor was walking through the forest, he saw a pack of wolves coming towards him and he had to climb a tree to get rid of them. The wolves were left at first wondering what to do, but the one whose tail had been torn off by the tailor, eager to take revenge on him, proposed to the others that they climb on top of each other until the last one reached the besieged, offering himself to serve as a base and support for the others. The wolves followed his advice, but the tailor, who had recognized his mutilated visitor, suddenly cried, "Take him by the tail." And the tailed wolf was so frightened at the recollection of his unfortunate adventure, that he ran and threw the rest. This tale integrates the background of the tree in which the wolves appear perched in the dream. But it also contains an unequivocal allusion to the castration complex. The tailor mutilated the old wolf by tearing off its tail. The long fox tails that the wolves display in the dream are surely compensations for such mutilation. Why are there 6 or 7 wolves? The patient seemed unable to answer this question until I questioned whether the picture that scared him could correspond to the Little Red Hood story. This story does not give, in fact, the occasion for more than 2 corresponding illustrations, respectively, the meeting of the Little Red Riding Hood with the wolf in the forest and the scene in which the wolf appears lying down and wearing the grandmother's bonnet. Behind the memory of that picture, then, another story must have been hidden. Thus oriented, the subject did not take long to find that such a tale could only be that of the wolf and the 7 little goats. In it appears the number 7, but also 6, since the wolf devours only 6 goats, since the seventh hides in the case of the clock. The color white also appears in this story, as the wolf has one of its paws whitened by the baker to prevent the goats from recognizing him again, as before, by showing himself to him in his gray fur. Both stories have, moreover, many common points. In both we find that the wolf devours someone and then they open its belly, taking out the people or the devoured animals and replacing them with stones, and both also end with the death of the evil beast. In the tale of the 7 little goats, a tree also appears, because after eating the little goats, the wolf lies down to sleep in the shade of a tree and snores uncontrollably. Because of a particular circumstance we will have to return to this dream in another place, and then we will complete its study and its interpretation. It is a first anxiety dream dreamed in childhood, and whose content, related to other immediately successive dreams and to certain events in the subject's childhood, arouses special interest. For the moment we will limit ourselves to the relationship of the dream with 2 stories that present broad coincidences, Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf and the 7 Little Goats. The impression that these tales made on the childish subject manifested itself in a true zoophobia that only differed from other similar cases in that the feared object was not an animal easily accessible to the subject's perception, such as, for example, the dog or the horse, but only known by hearsay and by pictures in the storybook. We will explain on another occasion what explanation these zoophobias have and what their significance is. For now, we will only anticipate that such an explanation harmonizes perfectly with the main character of our subject's neurosis in later periods of his life. The main reason for his illness had been his fear of his father, and both his life and his behavior in treatment were governed by his ambivalent attitude towards any substitute for the father. If for our patient the wolf was only a first substitute for the father, we will have to ask ourselves if the tale of the wolf that devours the goats and that of the Little Red Hood, they integrate, as a secret content, something other than the infantile fear of the father. In addition, our patient's father, like so many other adults, had the habit of jokingly threatening children, and surely in his games with his son during his earliest childhood, he had to say affectionately more than once, "I'm leaving you to eat." Another of my patients once told me that his 2 children had never been able to warm to their grandfather because when he played with them he used to jokingly scare them by telling them that he was going to open their bellies to see what was inside. Leaving aside everything that might anticipate our use of this dream in analytic work, we will return to its direct interpretation. I have to state that such an interpretation was the task of several years. The patient reported this dream early in the treatment and soon shared my conviction that the cause of his childhood neurosis was hidden behind it. In the course of the treatment we repeatedly returned to it, but it was only in the last months of the cure that we were able to unravel it completely, and certainly thanks to the spontaneous efforts of the patient. He had always emphasized 2 factors in his dream that had impressed him more than all the rest. First, the utter immobility of the wolves, and second, the intense attention with which they all watched him. Also the tenacious sense of reality with which the dream ended seemed to him worthy of attention. We will link our interpretive work to this last sensation. From our experience of dream interpretation we know that such a sensation of reality carries a certain significance. It reveals to us that in the latent material of the dream there is something that aspires to be remembered as real, that is, that the dream refers to an event that actually occurred and not just fantasized. Naturally, it can only be the reality of something unknown, so that the conviction, for example, that the grandfather had really told the story of the tailor and the wolf, or that he had heard the story of Little Red Riding Hood, or that of the wolf and the 7 little goats, could never be reflected in the sensation of reality prolonged after the dream. This seemed to allude to an event whose reality was thus accentuated in contrast to the unreality of the stories. If behind the content of the dream we were to suppose that there existed such an unknown scene, that is, forgotten at the time of the dream, such a scene must have been much earlier. The subject tells us that at the time of his dream he was 3 or 4 years old, 5 at the most, and for our part we can add that the dream reminded him of something that must belong to an even earlier time. The discovery of the content of such a scene should have been facilitated by what the subject highlighted in the manifest dream content, that is, by the attentive gaze of the wolves and their immobility. Naturally, we hope that this material reproduces the unknown material of the searched scene with any distortion, a distortion that may perhaps consist of a transformation into the opposite. Several conclusions could be drawn from the raw material that the first analysis of the dream had provided us. Behind the mention of the flocks of sheep, evidence of child sexual investigation should be sought, whose interrogations the subject could see satisfied in his visits with the father to the sheepfolds, but also indications of fear of death, since the sheep had mostly succumbed to epizootics. The most pronounced element of the dream, that is, the situation of the wolves in the branches of the tree, led directly to the story of the grandfather, in which only his relationship with the subject of castration could be exciting and the stimulus of the dream. From the first incomplete analysis of the dream, we also deduced that the wolf was a substitute for the father, so that this first anxiety dream would have externalized that fear of the father, who from then on had to dominate the subject's life. Such a conclusion was not yet, in any way, forced. But if we put together as a result of the provisional analysis all that can be deduced from the material provided by the subject, we will already have the following fragments for reconstruction. A real event occurred in a very early period: staring immobility, sexual problems, castration, the father, something terrible. One fine day the subject spontaneously began the continuation of the interpretation of his dream. He was of the opinion that that fragment of it in which the window opened by itself was not fully explained by its relationship with the window behind which the tailor in the story worked and through which the wolf entered. In his opinion, it must have had another meaning, that of his own suddenly opening his eyes. He meant, then, to say that while he was asleep he had woken up suddenly and had seen something, the tree with the wolves. Nothing could be objected against such an interpretation, which could also serve as the basis for new deductions. He had woken up and seen something. The fixed contemplation attributed in the dream to the wolves should rather be attributed to the subject himself. It turned out, therefore, that in a decisive detail an inversion had been fulfilled, which, moreover, was already announced by another integrated in the manifest dream content that showed the wolves perched on the branches, while in the grandfather's story they were down and could not climb the tree. And if the other detail accentuated by the subject were also deformed by an inversion? Then, instead of immobility, the wolves kept still, staring at him, but not moving. It would be a restless movement. Thus, the subject would have woken up suddenly and would have seen before him a very moving scene, which he contemplated with intense attention. In the first case the deformation would have consisted in a transposition of subject and object, activity and passivity, being looked at instead of looking, and in the second in a transformation into the antithetical, immobility instead of movement. Another association that suddenly emerged gave us a new approach to sleep intelligence. The tree was the Christmas tree. The subject now remembered having dreamed that a few days before Christmas Eve, being agitated by the expectation of the gifts he was going to receive. As Christmas Eve was also his birthday, we were already able to fix, with complete certainty, the date of the dream and of the transformation from which it was the starting point. It had been shortly before he was 4 years old. The childish subject had gone to bed excited by the expectation that the proximity of the day that was to bring him double gifts aroused in him. We know that in such circumstances children easily anticipate in their dreams the fulfillment of their wishes. Thus, in our patient's it was already Christmas Eve and the content of the dream showed him the gifts intended for him hanging from the tree. But such gifts had turned into wolves, and in the dream the child ended up feeling afraid of being devoured by the wolf, probably by the father, and taking refuge under the nanny's protection. Knowledge of their sexual evolution prior to the dream makes it possible for us to fill in the existing gap in the dream and clarify the transformation of satisfaction into anguish. Among the desires that produced the dream, the strongest must have been that of the sexual satisfaction that at that time he longed to receive from his father. The intensity of such desire succeeded in reviving the long-forgotten memory trace of a scene in which he himself witnessed his father procuring sexual satisfaction for someone, and the result of this evolution was the appearance of fear-terror in the face of compliance. Of his desire, repression of the impulse represented by it and, consequently, fleeing away from the father and together with the less dangerous nursemaid. The significance that Christmas Eve had thus integrated for him had been preserved in the alleged memory of having suffered the first fit of anger because he had not been satisfied with the gifts received on that date. This recollection included exact and inaccurate elements and could not be accepted as true without some modification, since according to the repeated statements of his relatives, the change in the subject's character had already made itself felt at the beginning of autumn, that is, long before Christmas Eve. But the essentials of the relationships between erotic dissatisfaction, anger, and Christmas Eve had been preserved in memory. Now then, what could be the image conjured up by the nocturnal performance of sexual desire, with enough power to separate, fearful, the subject from the fulfillment of his desires? According to the material provided by the analysis, such an image had to fulfill a condition, since it had to be adequate to support the conviction of the existence of castration. The fear of castration was then the engine of the transformation of the effects. Here comes the point at which I have to separate myself from the course of the analysis, and I fear it is also the one in which he completely abandons the confidence of the reader. What had to be activated that night in the case of traces of unconscious impressions was the image of coitus between the subject's parents, carried out in not entirely usual circumstances and especially favorable for observation. The repeated return of the dream during the course of the treatment, in innumerable variants and new additions that were successively explained by the analysis, allowed us to gradually obtain satisfactory answers to all the questions that had to be linked to said scene. Thus it turned out, in the first place, that the boy's age when he surprised her was 1.5 years. He then suffered from a malarial fever, whose attacks returned daily at a certain time. From the age of 10 he began to suffer, 4 seasons, depressions that began in the early afternoon and reached its maximum level around 5. This symptom still persisted at the time of the analytic treatment. Such bouts of depression replaced those of fever or prostration suffered in that past childhood period, and 5 in the afternoon must have been the hour in which the fever reached its maximum level, or that in which the infantile subject surprised the coitus of their parents, if they both coincided. Probably because of his illness, his parents had welcomed him into their conjugal bedroom. Such an illness, also confirmed by family tradition, leads us to place the event in the summer and thus assume for the subject, born on Christmas Eve, an age of n+1 years. He slept, then, in his little bed, placed in his parents' bedroom, and woke up, perhaps because of the rise in fever, late in the afternoon and perhaps precisely at 5, the appointed time after his bouts of depression. Our hypothesis that it was a hot summer day harmonizes the fact that the parents had retired for a nap and were half naked on top of the bed. When the boy woke up, he witnessed a tergotic coitus repeated 3 times, he was able to see his mother's and his father's genitals and fully understood the process and its significance. Finally, he interrupted his parents' business in such a way that we'll talk later. Deep down, there is nothing extraordinary about it, nor does it give the impression of being the product of a heated fantasy, that a young married couple, married a few years before, caress each other during siesta hours on a hot summer afternoon without having note the presence of a 1.5-year-old boy, peacefully asleep in his crib. In my opinion, it is something trivial and everyday, without there being anything strange about the position chosen for intercourse, all the more so since it cannot be deduced from the evidence that it was performed every time in the indicated position. A single time would have been enough to provide the spectator with an opportunity to make observations that another position of the actors would have made difficult or even excluded. The very content of the scene cannot therefore constitute an argument against its plausibility, which will rather be based on 3 other different circumstances. First, that a child of the early age of 1.5 years can receive the perceptions of a process so complicated and keep them so faithfully in your unconscious. Second, that later, at 4 years of age, and a posteriori elaboration of the impressions received is possible, aimed at facilitating their understanding, and third, that there is a procedure capable of making conscious in a coherent and convincing way the details of such a scene, lived and understood in similar circumstances. We will carefully examine these and other objections, assuring the reader that, for our part, we adopt an attitude no less critical than he when faced with the hypothesis that the child could make such an observation, but asking him to decide with us to provisionally accept the reality of the scene. We first want to continue the study of the relationships of this primary scene, *383, with the dream, the symptoms, and the history of the patient. We will separately pursue the effects emanating from its essential content and those that have their starting point in one of its visual impressions. Such a visual impression corresponds to the postures that the child saw the parental couple adopt, the father upright, and the mother crouching in an animal position. We have already seen that in the period of childhood fear of the subject, his sister used to frighten him by showing him a picture from the storybook, in which the wolf appeared walking on 2 feet, with extended claws and pricked ears. During the treatment, he took the trouble to search through old-fashioned bookstores until he found that book of stories from his childhood, and recognized the image that frightened him so much in an illustration of the tale of the wolf and the 7 little goats. He was of the opinion that the wolf's posture in that print might have reminded him of his father's in the primal scene. Such print was, in any case, the starting point of further media. When he was already 7 or 8 years old, they told him that the next day a new teacher would come to teach him. He dreamed at night that such a teacher, in the figure of a lion, and in the same position as the wolf in the famous print, was approaching roaring to his bed and awoke again, seized with anguish. Since the subject had already mastered his wolf phobia, he was in a position to choose a new animal as an object of anxiety, and in that later dream he elevated the announced teacher to the status of father substitute. In the later years of his childhood, each and every one of his teachers played this same role as father substitutes, being invested with paternal influence, both for good and for evil. Fate provided the subject with a unique opportunity to revive his wolf phobia in his high school days and to convert the relationship that said phobia entailed in his background into a starting point for serious inhibitions. Indeed, the teacher in charge of the Latin class was called Lobo. The subject was intimidated by him at first, and when he was later severely reprimanded for having committed an absolutely stupid mistake in a Latin translation, he could no longer free himself from an intense fear of that professor, fear that soon spread to everyone else. Also, the reason that attracted the cited rebuke was related to his complexes. It was, in fact, trying to translate the Latin word filius, and the subject did so with the French word fils, instead of using the corresponding term from his mother tongue. And it is that the wolf was still the father. The first of the passing symptoms that the patient produced in the treatment was still related to the phobia of the wolf and the tale of the wolf and the 7 little goats. In the room where the first sessions of the treatment took place, there was a large case clock in front of the patient, who was stretched out on a divan, almost with his back to the place I was occupying, and I was surprised to see that the subject returned from time to time. When his face turned towards me with a kind expression, as if trying to ingratiate himself with me, and then looked at the clock. At the time, I supposed that this was how he was showing the desire to see the hour of treatment finished soon, but much later the subject himself spoke to me about those maneuvers of his, and he sought an explanation for me, remembering that the smallest of the 7 goats was hiding in the box of the clock, while her sisters were devoured by the wolf. So he wanted to say to me at that time, "Be good to me. Should I be afraid of you? Will you eat me? Shall I run away from you and hide, like the youngest goat, in the watch case?" The wolf that scared him was undoubtedly the father, but his fear of the wolf was linked to the condition that he himself should be shown in an erect position. His memory reminded him precisely that other prints that represented the wolf walking on all fours or lying in bed, as in the illustration of the Little Red Hood, had never frightened him. The position that, according to our reconstruction of the primal scene, I had seen the woman adopt was certainly no less important, but such importance remained limited to the sexual terrain. The most singular phenomenon of his erotic life after puberty consisted of fits of obsessive sexual infatuation, which appeared and disappeared in enigmatic succession, unleashing in him a gigantic energy, even in periods of inhibition, and completely escaping his control. A very interesting relationship forces me to postpone the complete study of these obsessive crushes, but I can already anticipate that they were linked to a certain condition, hidden from his consciousness, and that it only appeared in it during the cure. The woman had to be shown to him in the posture that we have ascribed to the mother in the primordial scene. Since her puberty, she had seen the greatest female attraction in round opulent buttocks, and cohabitation, in a different position from coitus a tergo, gave her almost no pleasure. The objection here is that such a sexual preference is a general character of people prone to obsessional neurosis, and its derivation from a particular impression of childhood is therefore not justified. It belongs to the picture of the erotic anal disposition, counting itself among those archaic features that characterize such constitution. In the more ferrum coitus we can see, in fact, the oldest form of cohabitation from the phylogenetic point of view. We will return to this point later, when we have exposed the material referring to his unconscious erotic condition. Let us continue, then, the examination of the relations between the dream and the primal scene. According to our hopes, the dream was to show the child, excited by the upcoming fulfillment of his desires on Christmas Eve, the image of the sexual satisfaction procured by his father, just as he had seen it in that primordial scene and as a model of the satisfaction that he wished to receive from him. But instead of that image appears the material of the story that his grandfather had told him shortly before, the tree, the wolves, and the lack of a tail, represented in the form of supercompensation by the leafy tails of the supposed wolves. Here we lack a link, an associative bridge that leads us from the content of the primordial story to that of the wolf tale, and such a link is provided for us again by the position and only by it. In the grandfather's tale, the tailed wolf invites the others to climb on top of him. This detail awakened the memory of the image of the primal scene, and in this way the material of the primal scene could already be represented by that of the tail of the wolf, at the same time being replaced in the desired way by the dual figure of the parents. The plurality of wolves. Lastly, the adaptation of the material from the tail of the tailor and the wolf to the content of the tale of the 7 little goats, from which he took the number 7, imposed a new modification to the dream content. The transformation of the material primordial scene, tale of the wolf, tale of the 7 little goats reflects the progression of thought during the elaboration of the dream, desire to achieve sexual satisfaction with the help of the father, recognition of the condition of castration, to her linked, fear of the father. In my opinion, the dream of anxiety, dreamed by our subject at the age of 4, is thus exhaustively clarified. After what has been previously stated, I can now specify brief indications about the pathogenic effect of the primal scene and the alteration that its awakening caused in the sexual evolution of the subject. We will pursue only that effect that the dream externalizes. Later on we will explain that not a single sexual current emanated from the primordial scene, but a whole series of them, as in a fragmentation of the libido. We will also have to take into account that the activation of this scene, I intentionally avoid using the word memory, causes the same effects as if it were a recent event. The scene acts after the fact, without having lost any of its freshness in the interval between 1.5 years and 4 years. Perhaps we will find a new point of support later on to demonstrate that already at the time of its perception, that is, from the subject's 1.5 years, it caused certain effects. When the patient delved into the situation of the primordial scene, he brought to light the following self-perceptions. He had initially assumed that the observed process was a violent act, but this hypothesis did not harmonize with the pleasant expression that he had noticed on his mother's face, thus having to recognize that it was a satisfaction. The essentially new thing that the observation of his parents' sexual intercourse had to procure in him was the conviction of the reality of castration, the possibility of which had already occupied his thoughts before. The sight of the two girls urinating, the maid's threat, the governess's interpretation of the colored candies, the memory that her father had cut a snake into pieces. Well, now she saw with her own eyes the wound, of which the maid had told her, and she understood that her existence was an indispensable condition of the sexual intercourse with her father. He could no longer, therefore, confuse her with the behind as when he saw the girls urinate. The outcome of his dream was an attack of anguish, from which he could not calm down until he had his girl next to him. So he fled away from his father, taking refuge under the shelter of the babysitter. Such anguish was a rejection of the desire that his father would give him sexual satisfaction, a desire that had inspired the dream. Its expression in the fear of being devoured by the wolf was only a mutation regressive, as we will see later, of the desire to serve the father as a sexual object, that is, to be satisfied by him as his mother. His last sexual goal, the passive attitude towards his father, had succumbed to repression, being replaced by fear of his father in the form of wolf phobia. What could be the driving force behind this repression? According to the general situation, it could not be more than the narcissistic genital libido, which resisted, as a concern of losing his virile member, against a satisfaction, of which the relinquishment of it seemed an indispensable condition. From the threatened narcissism the subject extracted the virility with which he defended himself against the passive attitude towards his father. We now see that at this point in our discussion we have to modify our terminology. During his sleep the subject had analyzed a new phase of his sexual organization. Until then the sexual antitheses had been activity and passivity for him. His sexual end was from seduction a passive end, that of having his genitals touched, and then it was transformed, by regression to the previous stage of the sadistic anal organization, into the masochistic end of being punished and beaten, being indifferent to reaching it with the man or with the woman. In this way the subject had passed from the maiden to his father, without taking into account the difference of sex at all. He had asked the girl to touch his member, and he had wanted to irritate his father so that he would punish him. In all this the genital organ was not involved at all. In the fantasy of being hit on the penis, the relationship was still externalized, covered up by the regression. The activation of the primal scene in the dream then brought him back to the genital organization. She discovered the vagina and the biological significance of the concepts masculine and feminine, and already understood that active was the same as masculine, and passive, the same as feminine. His passive sexual end would then have had to become a feminine end and take as an expression that of serving the father as a sexual object instead of being hit by him on the member or behind. This feminine purpose succumbed to repression and had to allow itself to be replaced by the fear of the wolf. We must here interrupt the discussion of their sexual evolution until later stages of their history shed new light on these earlier ones. Regarding the wolf phobia, we will add that both the father and the mother were wolves for the subject. The mother was the castrated wolf, who let the others climb on top of him, and the father, the wolf who climbed on top of him. But his fear did not refer, as we have already heard him assure, more than the wolf in an erect position, that is, the father. It should also surprise us that the fear, with which the dream unfolded, had a model in the grandfather's story. In it, the castrated wolf who has allowed the others to climb on top of him is seized with fear as soon as he is reminded of his taillessness. It seems, then, that the subject had to identify himself during the dream process with the castrated mother, and then resisted against such identification. We will give a translation of this point, which we assume to be accurate. If you want to be sexually satisfied by your father, you have to allow yourself to be castrated, like your mother, and you cannot want that. It is, then, a clear protest of masculinity. But we will have to take into account that the sexual evolution of the case that we are pursuing here has the great disadvantage for our investigation of having been disturbed multiple times. It is first decisively influenced by seduction and then diverted by the observation of coitus, which acts a posteriori as a second seduction. 5. Discussion. It has been said that the polar bear and the whale cannot make war because, being each confined to its element, it is impossible for them to approach each other. Well then, it is identically impossible for me to argue with those psychologists and neurologists who do not recognize the premises of psychoanalysis and consider its results artificial. On the other hand, opposition has developed in recent years on the part of other researchers who, at least in their own judgment, remain within the field of analysis and who do not deny its technique or its results, but believe they have the right to draw different conclusions from the same material and subject it to different interpretations. Now then, the theoretical contradiction is almost always fruitless. As soon as we start to move away from the basic material, we are in danger of getting drunk on our own claims and ending up holding views that all observation would have shown to be wrong. It seems to me, then, that it is much more appropriate to combat divergent theories by contrasting them with concrete cases and problems. I have said before that the following circumstances will surely be dismissed as improbable. First, that a child of the early age of 1.5 years can receive the perceptions of so complicated a process and keep them so easily in his unconscious. Second, that later, at 4 years of age, it is possible to elaborate a posteriori the impressions received in order to facilitate their understanding. And third, that there is a procedure capable of making the details of a scene conscious in a coherent and convincing way. Lived and understood in similar circumstances. The last question is purely factual. Whoever takes the trouble to carry the analysis to such depths, by means of the prescribed technique, will be convinced that such a procedure exists. On the other hand, whoever does not do so and interrupts the analysis in any stratum closer to the surface, will have renounced at the same time all possibility of finding it. But with this, the interpretation of what has been achieved through the abyssal analysis is not resolved. The other two objections are based on an insufficient appreciation of the impressions of early childhood, of which it is not accepted that they can produce such lasting effects. Such objections want to look almost exclusively for the motivation of the neuroses in the more serious conflicts of later life and assume that the importance of childhood is not feigned in analysis by the inclination of neurotics to express their present interests in reminiscence and symbols of its most distant past. With such an estimate of the infant factor, many of the more intimate peculiarities of the analysis disappeared, but also, on the other hand, much of what creates resistance against them and alienates the confidence of the layman. We therefore put into discussion the theory that those scenes from early childhood, to which we come to knowledge in any exhaustive analysis of a neurosis, for example, in our case, would not be reproductions of real events to which we could attribute an influence on the shaping of later life and on the production of symptoms, but fantasies provoked by stimuli belonging to adulthood intended for a somewhat symbolic representation of real desires and interests and which owe their genesis to a regressive tendency, to a diversion from the tasks of the present. This being so, it would be possible to dispense with all the puzzling analytic hypotheses about the mental life and intellectual function of his earliest childhood years. In favor of this theory speak not only the desire that is common to all of us to find a rationalization and a simplification of our difficult work, but also certain effective factors. And we can also free it from the beginning of an objection that would arise precisely in the mind of the analyst. Practical. We must confess, in effect, that the fact that such a conception of these infantile scenes proved to be correct would not bring about any immediate modification in the practice of analysis. Once the neurotic has the pernicious peculiarity of diverting his interest from the present and attaching it to such regressive substitutions, product of his fantasy, we can only follow him on his path and bring these unconscious products to his consciousness, because, although they lack any value of reality, they are very valuable for us as current substrates of interest in the patient, an interest that we want to separate from them to direct them towards the tasks of the present. Therefore, the analysis would follow exactly the same course as those others in which the analyst, naive and trusting, he believes such fantasies to be true. The difference will emerge only at the end of the analysis, once the reference fantasies have been discovered. We would then say to the patient, your neurosis has elapsed as if you had received such impressions in your childhood and then built on them. But you will recognize that this is not possible. They were simply products of your imaginative activity designed to divert you from real tasks in life. Now we will investigate what those tasks were and what paths of connection have existed between them and their fantasies. This solution of childhood fantasies could then be followed by a second phase of treatment already oriented towards real life. Technically, it would be impossible to shorten this path, that is, to modify the usual course of psychoanalytic treatment up to now. If we do not make the patient aware of such fantasies in all their amplitude, we will not be able to facilitate the free disposition of the interest linked to them. If we remove him from them as soon as we suspect their existence and glimpse their general contours, we will only support the work of repression, by which they have become inaccessible to all the efforts of the patient. And if we prematurely deprive them of their value, communicating, for example, to the subject that they will only be fantasies devoid of any real significance, we will never achieve their collaboration to bring them to their consciousness. Thus, proceeding correctly, the analytic technique will not undergo any modification, whatever the value that is given to the childish scenes discussed. We have said that the conception of these scenes as regressive fantasy can claim in support certain effective factors. First of all, the following: these childhood scenes are not reproduced in the cure as memories, they are the results of construction. Surely, there will be someone who believes the problem has been solved with this single confession. But I don't want to be misunderstood. Every analyst knows very well and has verified infinite times that, in a successful cure, the patient communicates a multitude of spontaneous memories of his childhood years, for whose appearance or, perhaps, for whose first appearance the doctor does not feel in any way responsible, since it has never oriented the patient with any attempt at reconstruction towards such contents. These previously unconscious memories do not even have to be true, they can be, but many times they have been distorted against the truth and interwoven with fantasized elements, as happens with the so-called cover memories, which are preserved spontaneously. I only want to say that scenes like our subjects, belonging to such an early childhood period, with such content and of such extraordinary significance in the history of the case, are not generally reproduced as memories, but have to be divined constructed step by step and very laboriously from a sum of allusions and clues. Now, I am not of the opinion that these scenes have to necessarily be fantasies because they are not evoked as memories. The fact that they are replaced, as in our case, by dreams whose analysis regularly leads us to the same scene and which reproduce, tirelessly transforming them, each and every fragment of its content seems to me quite equivalent to recollection. Dreaming is also a remembering, although under the conditions of the state of rest and dream production. This return in dreams explains why the patient himself gradually develops a firm conviction of the reality of the primal scenes, a conviction that in no way yields to that founded on recollection. However, my adversaries should not be forced to abandon the fight before this argument, already giving it up for lost, because, as is known, there is the possibility of guiding the dreams of a third party. And thus, the analyzer's conviction may be a result of suggestion, for which a role in the play of forces of analytic treatment is still being sought. The old-school psychotherapist would suggest to his patient that he had regained his health, mastered his inhibitions, etc. And, on the other hand, the psychoanalytic would suggest to him that he had had such or such an experience as a child that he now had to remember in order to be cured. Such would be the only difference between the two. We will have to state that this last attempt at an explanation by our adversaries reduces the significance of the children's scenes much more than their purpose seemed at first. They said, in effect, that they were not realities, but fantasies, and now it turns out that they are not even fantasies of the patient, but of the analyst himself, who imposes them on the patient through certain personal complexes. It is clear that the analyst who hears himself make this reproach will evoke, for his peace of mind, how little by little the construction of that fantasy supposedly inspired by him in the patient has been taking shape, how independent of medical stimulus its conformation has been shown in many points, how from a certain phase of the treatment everything seemed to converge towards it, how then, in the synthesis, the most diverse and singular effects emanated from them, and how in that one hypothesis the great and small problems and singularities of the history found their solution. Of the disease, and will state that sufficient insight is not recognized to discover an event that alone can fulfill all these conditions. But neither will this allegation have any effect on the opponents, who have not experienced the analysis themselves. They will continue to say that the psychoanalytic is deluding himself, and he will accuse them, for his part, of an absolute lack of insight, without it being possible to reach any decision. We will now examine another of the factors favorable to the contrary conception of constructed children's scenes. It is as follows: all the processes alleged for the explanation of such products discussed as fantasies really exist, and their importance must be recognized. The diversion of interest from the tasks of real life, number 1345, the existence of fantasies as substitute products for omitted acts, the regressive tendency that manifests itself in such creations, regressive in more ways than one, insofar as they start simultaneously a departure from life and a return to the past. All of this is accurate and can be checked regularly by means of analysis. Consequently, it is to be expected that it will also suffice to clarify the alleged childhood reminiscences discussed, and according to the economic principles of science, such an explanation would have to be preferred to one for which new and puzzling hypotheses are necessary. I would like to draw the attention of my readers here to the fact that the objections formulated until today against psychoanalysis, they generally follow the form of taking the part for the whole. A part of the efficient factors is extracted from a highly composed set, proclaimed true, and then denied, in its favor, the other part and the whole. Examining more closely which group has been the object of such a preference, we find that it is always the one that integrates what is already known by other paths to what can most easily be linked to it. Jung thus chooses actuality and regression, and Adler egotistical motives. On the other hand, what is new and peculiarly proper to the analysis is abandoned and rejected as erroneous. It is by this path that it is easier to reject the revolutionary progress of uncomfortable psychoanalysis. It will not be useless to emphasize that none of the factors on which our opponents support their conception of children's scenes has had to be taught by Jung as something new. The current conflict, the withdrawal from reality, the substitute satisfaction in fantasy, and the regression to the material of the past, all this has always constituted, in precisely the same setting and perhaps with fewer terminological modifications, an integral part of my own theory. But it does not constitute the whole, but only the fragment that integrates that part of the motivation that collaborates in the production of neuroses, acting from reality as a starting point and in a regressive direction. Along with it, I have left enough room for a second progressive influence that works on the basis of childhood impressions, shows the way to the libido that withdraws from life and makes the otherwise inexplicable regression to childhood understandable. Thus, according to my theory, the two factors collaborate in the production of symptoms. But there is still an earlier collaboration that seems to me equally important, since the influence of childhood already becomes noticeable in the initial situation of the production of the neuroses, insofar as it determines, in a decisive way, whether the individual has to fail in the overcoming the real problems of life and where to fail. Thus, the importance of the infant factor is discussed. Our task will be to find a practical example that can demonstrate such importance without leaving any room for doubt. Such an example is precisely the pathological case that we are going to explain in such detail here, and that is characterized by the particularity that the neurosis of adulthood was preceded by a neurosis suffered in early childhood. Precisely for this circumstance I have chosen this case for your communication. If someone wants to reject it on the grounds that zoophobia does not seem important enough to recognize it as an independent neurosis, we will have to point out that an obsessive ceremonial and acts and ideas of the same character were linked without any interval to this phobia, which we will deal with in the following sections. Following chapters of this study. A neurotic illness in the 4th or 5th year of childhood demonstrates, above all, that childhood experiences alone are enough to produce a neurosis, without it being necessary to flee from a task posed by life. It will be objected that the child is also constantly faced with tasks from which he might want to escape. Exact, but the life of a child before his school days is easy to review, and it can be investigated whether there was a task in it that determined the causation of the neurosis. But we only discover instinctive impulses whose satisfaction is impossible for the child, also still incapable of subduing them, and the sources from which these impulses flow. The enormous shortening of the interval between the explosion of the neurosis and the period of the childhood experiences discussed makes it possible, as was to be expected, to reduce the regressive part of the causation to a minimum, and presents to view, without any veil, the progressive part of the causation. Itself, the influence of previous impressions. We hope that the present clinical record clearly illustrates this circumstance. And for still other reasons, infantile neurosis gives a decisive answer to the question of the nature of the primal scenes, that is, of the earliest childhood experiences discovered in analysis. If we assume as an indisputable premise that such a primary scene has been irreproachably developed from the technical point of view, that it is indispensable for the synthetic solution of all the enigmas that the symptom chart of childhood illness poses for us, and that all the effects emanate from all the threads of the analysis have been carried to her, as to her, such a scene cannot be, in terms of its content, more than the reproduction of a reality lived by the child. For the child, as well as the adult, can only produce fantasies with material acquired from somewhere. Now, the paths of such acquisition are partly closed to the child, for example, reading, and the time available for it is short and can easily be investigated in search of the corresponding sources. In our case, the primordial scene contains the image of sexual intercourse between the parents, and in a particularly favorable position for certain observations. Nothing would testify sufficiently in favor of the reality of the scene if it were a patient whose symptoms, that is, the effects of it, had appeared at any time in his adult life. Such a patient may have acquired in the most different moments of the long interval the impressions, representations, and knowledge that later, transformed into a fantastic image, are projected regressively on his childhood and adhered to his parents. But when the effects of such a scene appear when the subject is 4 or 5 years old, the child must have witnessed it at an even earlier age. And then all the puzzling conclusions to which the analysis of infantile neurosis has led us stand. It is as if someone wanted to suppose that the patient had not only unconsciously fantasized the primal scene, but had also conspired in the alteration of his character, his fear of the wolf and his religious obsession, a hypothesis openly contradicted by the idiosyncrasy of the subject and by the testimony directly from their relatives. So I see no possibility of reaching any other conclusion. Either the analysis that you have in your childhood neurosis as your starting point is, in general, nonsense, or everything happened exactly as we have described it. We were also surprised by the equivocal circumstance that the patient's preference for the female buttocks and for intercourse in that position in which they stand out most especially, seems to require in this case a derivation from the observation of parental intercourse, while it was a general feature of archaic constitutions predisposed to obsessional neurosis. But now we find a simple explanation that solves the contradiction, showing it to us as an overdetermination. The person whom the subject saw having intercourse in such a position was his own father, from whom he may well have inherited such a constitutional preference. Neither the subsequent illness of the father nor the history of the family contradict this hypothesis, since, as we have already said, a brother of the father died in a state that had to be considered as the outcome of a severe obsessional neurosis. In this regard, we recall that the subject's sister, when seducing him when he was 3 years and 3 months old, launched the singular slander against the honest and old nanny that she turned men upside down and then took their genitals. At this point the idea must have imposed itself on us that the sister might also have witnessed in equally early years the same scene as her brother later, having extracted from them the stimulus to place the actors upside down in the sexual act. This hypothesis would indicate also one of the sources of his own sexual precocity. Originally I did not have the intention of continuing the discussion of the real value of the primal scenes beyond this point, but since in the meantime I have had the opportunity to deal with this subject in my lectures in introductory lessons to psychoanalysis, in a broader context and without polemical intention, it would be very given to misinterpretations if it omitted the application of the points of view that are determining there to the case that concerns us here. Thus, I will continue the study complementing and rectifying, when necessary, what has been previously stated. A different conception of the primal scene on which the dream is based is still possible, a conception that is far removed from the conclusion established before and which clears up some difficulties for us. In any case, the theory that wants to reduce children's scenes to regressive symbols will not gain anything from this modification. On the contrary, I think that it must be definitively refuted by this analysis of an infantile neurosis, as it would by any other. I think, in fact, that we can also explain the state of affairs in the form following. It is not possible for us to renounce the hypothesis that the boy had to observe coitus whose sight inspired him with the conviction that castration could be something more than a meaningless threat. And on the other hand, the importance that the attitudes of the man and the woman later showed to entail in terms of the development of anguish and as an erotic condition forces us to conclude that it must have been a coitus a tergo, more ferarum. But there is, instead, another factor that is not so essential and can be abandoned. It was not, perhaps, a coitus of the parents, but a coitus between animals that the child observed and then moved over the parents, as if he had deduced that the parents did not do otherwise either. In favor of this hypothesis, above all, the fact that the wolves in the dream were, in reality, cattle dogs and also appeared as such in the patient's drawing, testifies. A short time before the dream the boy had been taken several times by his father to visit the herds where he was able to see such large white dogs and probably also observe them in the act of coitus. The triple repetition that the patient assigned to the act without any motivation can also be related to this circumstance, supposing that he had preserved in his memory the fact of having surprised the cattle dogs in such a situation on 3 different occasions. What was then added to this in the excited expectation of the night of his dream was the transference of the recently acquired memory trace, in all its details, onto the parents, and it was already this transference which provoked the intense affects that we know of. An after the fact understanding of those impressions received perhaps a few weeks earlier than developed, a process we all know from having experienced it ourselves. The transference of the dogs in the act of coitus, on the parents, was not carried out by the subject through a verbal deductive process, but by searching in his memory for the memory of a real scene in which his parents appeared together and that could merge with the situation of coitus. Such a scene could faithfully reproduce all the details discovered in the analysis of the dream, but it could have been totally innocent, consisting only that one summer afternoon and during his illness the child would have woken up and seen his parents before him dressed in white summer clothes. All the rest would have been added, taking it from the observations made in the visits to the herds, the ulterior desire of the subject, possessed by sexual curiosity, to also surprise his parents in the act of coitus, and then the scene thus fantasized displayed all the reported effects, exactly the same as if there were been real and not artificially constructed with 2 elements, the one earlier and indifferent, and the other posterior and very impressive. We see immediately how diminished this is the margin of credulity that is attributed to us. We no longer need to assume that the parents had intercourse in the presence of their child, even a very young one, which for many of us constituted an unpleasant image, and the interval between the primal scene and its effects is also greatly shortened, understanding so only a few months of the subject's 4th year before reaching the first dark years of infancy. In the behavior of the child who transfers what he observed in dogs to his parents and is frightened of the wolf instead of being frightened of his father, hardly anything disconcerting remains. He is, in effect, in that phase of his conception of the universe which, in our chapter 4 of the 1913 essay Totem and Taboo, we have described as a return to totemism. The theory that attempts to explain the primordial scenes of neurosis as regressive fantasies of later times seems to find firm support in our observation, notwithstanding the early age of our neurotic, 4 years. In spite of her, She has managed to replace an impression received at the age of 4 with an imaginary trauma supposedly experienced when she was a year and a half. But this regression does not seem enigmatic or tendentious to us. The scene that was to be constructed had to fulfill certain conditions that, given the circumstances of the subject's life, could only have been fulfilled at that early age, for example, that of finding himself sleeping in his parents' bedroom. The observations that follow, drawn from the analytical results of other cases, will constitute for most of our readers the decisive test of the correctness of this new conception. The appearance in the analysis of neurotic patients of such a scene, be it a real memory or fantasy in which the subject surprises coitus between his parents, is not really unusual. It is very possible that the analysis of non-neurotic subjects revealed it to us with the same frequency, and perhaps it is part of the general, conscious, or unconscious memory heritage. But whenever the analysis has led me to such a scene, it has integrated the same peculiarity that surprised us so much in the case of our patient, that of referring to a tergocoitus, the only one that allows the viewer to inspect the genitals. In these cases we do not doubt for a single moment that it is a fantasy, stimulated, perhaps regularly, by the observation of sexual intercourse between animals. And there is still more. I have made it clear that my exposition of the primordial scene will remain incomplete, since I reserved it for later on to communicate in what way the child disturbed the coitus of the parents. Now I will add that the form of such a disturbance is also in all cases the same. I suppose that in all this I will have exposed myself to serious suspicions on the part of the readers of this case file. If I had such arguments in favor of such an interpretation of the primal scene, how could I have placed the responsibility of accepting another so absurd-looking one on myself? Or is it that it was only in the interval between the first writing of the clinical history and this supplement that I discovered the new data that forced me to rectify my initial interpretation, and I did not want to admit it for some reason? On the other hand, I will confess something else, and that is that I intend to close for now the discussion on the real value of the primal scene with a non-laquette. We have not yet reached the end of this history, and in its further course a factor will emerge that will disturb the security of what we now think we can rejoice in. Then it only remains for me to refer the readers to those passages of my lessons introductory to psychoanalysis, in which I have studied the problem of fantasies or primal scenes. 6. Obsessional neurosis. For the third time the subject suffered an influence that decisively modified his evolution. When he reached the age of 4.5, without his state of irritability and constant fear having improved, his mother decided to teach him sacred history in the hope of thus distracting and reviving him. And, indeed, he succeeded, since the initiation of religious dogmas put an end to the phase of anguish, but, instead, it brought with it a substitution of anxiety symptoms for obsessional symptoms. If until then it had been difficult for her to fall asleep because she was afraid of dreaming terrible things, like on that night close to Christmas, now she had to kiss, before going to bed, all the pictures of saints that hung on the walls of her bedroom and trace innumerable crosses on his own person and his bed. The subject's childhood is shown to us already clearly divided into the following periods: first, the prehistoric period until the seduction, at 3 years and 3 months, the period to which the primordial scene belongs; second, the period of character alteration until the anxiety dream, at 4 years; third, zoophobia until religious initiation, at 4.5 years, and from there, the phase of obsessional neurosis until the 10 years. Neither the nature of the circumstances nor that of our patient, characterized, on the contrary, by the conservation of all the antecedents and the coexistence of the most different currents, had to allow an instantaneous and precise substitution of one phase for the next. The irritability did not disappear when the anxiety arose and then spread, gradually diminishing through the time of religious fervor. On the other hand, in this last phase the wolf phobia does not appear at all. The obsessional neurosis showed a discontinuous course. The first attack was the longest and most intense, others appearing later at 8 and 10 years of the subject, and always after events visibly related to the content of the neurosis. The mother told her the sacred history herself and also made the maid read parts of the book to her and show her the illustrations. Naturally, they devoted maximum attention to the story of the Passion. The Cha-Cha, a woman as pious as she was superstitious, provided him with the explanations he demanded, having to hear and satisfy all the objections and doubts of a little critic. If the internal struggles that then began to move him ended in a victory for faith, it was largely due to the influence of the Cha-Cha. What the subject related to me as a memory of his reactions to the religious initiation aroused in me at first an absolute disbelief, since I judged that such thoughts could never be those of a child of 4.5 to 5 years, and I supposed that he displaced to this distant time of his past ideas from the reflections of his adulthood, already close to 30 years. But the patient precisely rejected such a hypothesis and, as on many other occasions, we could not reach an agreement on this point until the relationship of the remembered ideas with the contemporary symptoms, as well as their interpolation in his sexual evolution, forced me to give him credit. And I also had to tell myself that precisely those criticisms of the religious doctrines, which I was reluctant to attribute to a child, were only held by an ever smaller minority of adults and in the process of disappearing. I will begin by exposing his memories and only afterwards will I seek the path that will lead us to understand them. As we have already said, the impression that the content of the sacred history produced on the childish subject was not pleasant at first. He began by missing the passive character of Christ in his martyrdom and then the whole of his history, and directed his most severe criticism against God the Father. Being omnipotent, it was his fault that men were evil and tormented their fellow men, then going to hell for it. He should have made them good, and therefore he was responsible for all the evil and all the torment. The commandment to turn one cheek when one had been slapped on the other was incomprehensible to him, as well as how Christ would have wanted him to remove that chalice from him, and likewise that no miracle had happened to prove that he was really the Son of God. His penetration, thus awakened, knew how to search, with relentless rigor, for the weak points of the sacred poem. But it didn't take long for them to add to this rationalist critique ruminations and doubts that reveal the collaboration of secret impulses. One of the first questions he addressed to the girl was whether Christ also had a behind. The maid replied that Christ had been God and man at the same time and that as a man he had had and done the same as other humans. That did not satisfy the boy, but he knew how to console himself by telling himself that the bottom was just a continuation of the legs. The barely subdued fear of being forced to lower the sacred person of Christ arose again when the question occurred to him whether Christ too was subject to the need to defecate. He did not dare ask the maiden such a question, but he found by himself a better way out than the one his nanny would have found, for he told himself that if Christ had made wine out of nothing, he could also turn food into nothing and thus get rid of it. Of any need for excretion. Returning to a previously examined fragment of his sexual evolution, we will approach the understanding of these musings. We know that after the rejection of the cha-cha and the subsequent repression of the nascent genital activity, his sexual life had developed in the directions of sadism and masochism. He mistreated and tormented small animals and built fantasies whose content was both that he himself beat a horse and that the heir to the throne was mistreated. In sadism he maintained his primitive identification with his father, and in masochism he chose him as a sexual object. He was in that phase of the pregenital organization in which we see the disposition to obsessional neurosis. The effect of the dream, which placed him under the influence of the primordial scene, had enabled him to advance towards genital organization and to transform his masochism towards his father into a feminine attitude towards him, that is, into homosexuality. But the dream did not bring about such an advance, but was resolved in anguish. The relationship with his father, which from the sexual end of being mistreated by him, should have led him to the immediate end of serving him as a sexual object as a woman, was regressed, through the intervention of his narcissistic virility, to an even more primitive stage, and dissociated, but not resolved, by a displacement on a substitution of the father, apparent as a fear of being devoured by the wolf. Only by affirming the coexistence of the three sexual tendencies oriented towards the father, will we perhaps be able to accurately reflect the situation. From the dream on, the subject was homosexual in his unconscious, while in his neurosis he remained at the level of cannibalism, and while his earlier masochistic attitude continued to dominate the ensemble. All three streams had passive sexual purposes. The object was one, as was the sexual tendency, but both had experienced a dissociation on three different levels. Knowledge of sacred history gave him the possibility of sublimating the prevailing masochistic attitude towards his father. He became Christ, a personification that was greatly facilitated by the fact that he was born on Christmas Eve. With this he had become something great and, moreover, a circumstance on which at the beginning not enough emphasis had yet fallen, a man. In the question of whether Christ could have a behind, the repressed homosexual attitude is revealed, since such pondering could not mean more than the question of whether he could be used by his father as a woman, like the mother in the primordial scene. The solution of the other obsessive ideas will conform to this interpretation later. The repression of passive homosexuality was then matched by the concern that it was condemnable to mix such suppositions with the sacred person of Christ. He strove, then, to keep his new sublimation away from the compliments emanating from the sources of the repressed. But he didn't get it. We still do not understand why he also rebelled against the passive character of Christ, and against the ill treatment that his father imposed on him, thus beginning to deny, even in his sublimation, his masochistic idea, up to then maintained. We can assume that this second conflict was especially favorable to the appearance of the humiliating obsessive ideas of the first conflict, between the dominant masochistic current and the repressed homosexual current, since it is natural that in a mental conflict all the tendencies of the same sign are added, although they come from the most different sources. New communications will reveal the reason for his rebellion, and with it that of the criticism exerted on religion. His sexual investigation, too, had derived certain advantages from the knowledge of sacred history. Until then she had had no reason to suppose that children came only from the woman. On the contrary, his maid had made him believe that he belonged only to his father, and his sister only to his mother, and this more intimate relationship with his father had been very valuable to him. But now he heard that Mary was the mother of God. Consequently, the children came from the woman, and it was not possible to support the affirmations of the Cha-Cha. In addition, the accounts of the sacred history confused him as to who the father of Christ really was. He was inclined to believe that Joseph, but the maid told him that Jose had only been like his father and that the real father had been God, and such an explanation did not clear him of any doubts. He understood only that the relationship between father and son was not as close as he had always imagined. The boy somehow sensed the sentimental ambivalence with respect to his father integrated into all religions and attacked his own for relaxing that relationship with his father. Naturally, their opposition soon ceased to be a doubt of the truth of the doctrine and was directed, instead, directly against the person of God. God had dealt harshly and cruelly with his son and was no better with men. He had sacrificed his son and demanded the same of Abraham. The subject therefore began to fear God. If he was Christ, his father was God. But the God that religion imposed on him was not a satisfactory replacement for the father, whom he had loved and whom he did not want to be deprived of. His love for this father created his critical insight. He had to go through a late stage of his detachment from his father here. From his ancient love for his father, manifested already at a very early time, it was, then, where he drew the energy to attack God and the insight to develop his critique of religion. But, on the other hand, such hostility against the new God was not a primary act, since it had its prototype in an impulse hostile to the father, arisen under the influence of the dream of anguish, and it was, basically, nothing more than a revival of the same. The two antithetical sentimental impulses that were to govern his entire subsequent life coincided here, for the combat of ambivalence, on the subject of religion. What resulted as a symptom of this combat, the blasphemous ideas and the obsession of always associating the idea of God with those of garbage or dirty, was, for this reason, the authentic result of a compromise, as we were told. The analysis of these ideas in relation to anal eroticism will demonstrate this. Other different obsessional symptoms, of a less typical modality, refer, with equal certainty, to the father, but it also makes it possible to recognize the connection of the obsessional neurosis with the previous chance events. Among the pious ceremonials with which he finally purged his blasphemies, he also counted the commandment to breathe solemnly in certain circumstances. When he crossed himself, he always had to take a deep breath in or out. In their language, a single word brings together the meanings of breath and spirit. He therefore had to deeply inhale the Holy Spirit or exhale the evil spirits he had heard of or read about. To such evil spirits he also attributed those blasphemous ideas for which so many penances had to be imposed. But he was also forced to exhale deeply when he saw an old man, a man and, in general, crippled people deformed and worthy of pity, without knowing how to link such conduct with the spirits. He only realized that he did it to avoid looking like those unfortunates. Later, the analysis revealed to us, on the occasion of a dream, that the obsession to exhale deeply when he saw someone worthy of pity had arisen in him when he was already 6 years old, and was related to his father. The children had not seen their father for many months, when one day their mother announced that she was going to take them with her to the city to show them something that would make them very happy. And, indeed, he took them to the sanatorium where his father was, whose bad appearance inspired great compassion in the subject. The father was, then, also the prototype of all the invalids, beggars, and old people, before whom he had to exhale deeply, as in other cases is the imprecise forms that children see in states of fear or mocking caricatures that they draw. We shall see elsewhere that this sympathetic attitude is related to a special detail of the primordial scene, a detail that arises late in obsessional neurosis. The purpose of not seeing himself as those people worthy of pity, which motivated his obsession to exhale deeply in front of them, was, then, the old identification with the father, transformed into a negative sense. But in doing so, she was also copying her father in a positive sense, since the act of breathing heavily was an imitation of the agitated breathing observed in her father during intercourse, number 1349. Thus, the Holy Spirit owed its origin to the sign of male sexual agitation. The repression turned this breath into the bad spirit, for which there was also another genealogy, malaria or malaria, aria equals air, that the subject had suffered at the time of the primal scene. The rejection of these evil spirits corresponded to an obviously ascetic trait that was also expressed in other reactions. When the subject heard that Christ had introduced evil spirits into the bodies of pigs, which were then thrown off a cliff, he remembered that his sister had once fallen from a parapet onto the beach. So it was also an evil spirit and a pig. Starting from here, a short path led him to the Dios. Nasty. His father himself had also shown him dominated by sensuality. When he learned the story of the first man, he found it analogous to his own destinies, and in his conversations with the maid he hypocritically pretended to be astonished that Adam had allowed himself to be dragged into misfortune by a woman, promising that, for his part, he would never marry. At this time his enmity against women was intensely manifested, following the seduction of which his sister had made him the object. Such hostility was still too frequently disturb his erotic life. His sister was like that, for him, for a long time, the incarnation of temptation and sin. When he went to confession, he felt pure and free from all guilt. But immediately it seemed to him that his sister was waiting for an opportunity to lead him into sin again, and before he knew it he was starting a violent dispute with her, thus actually sinning. He was thus forced to reproduce, always anew, the fact of seduction. On the other hand, although his blasphemous ideas stung him extraordinarily, he had never made them the object of a confession. We have inadvertently penetrated into the symptom picture of the later years of obsessional neurosis and will therefore already inform our readers about its outcome, saving all the plenitude of things included in the interval. We already know that, apart from his permanent condition, he temporarily experienced aggravations, one of which is a circumstance that still cannot be made clear to us, when a child with whom he could identify died on the same street. When he was 10 years old, he was entrusted to a German tutor who soon acquired extraordinary influence over him. It is very instructive to find out that all his piety disappeared, never to return, when in his conversations with the tutor he realized that the substitute father did not attach any value to devotion or believe in the truth of religious doctrines. His religious fervor disappeared with his adherence to the father, now replaced by a new, more affordable father. In any case, this disappearance did not take effect without a final intensification of the obsessional neurosis, of which the subject especially remembers the obsession of thinking about the Holy Trinity every time he saw 3 piles of dung or rubbish in the stream. We know that the patient never gave in to any new stimuli without first making a last attempt to retain those that had lost their value. When his tutor invited him to renounce his cruelty against animals, he effectively ceased it, but not before carrying out, conscientiously, one last bloody killing of caterpillars. Even in psychoanalytic treatment he behaved like this, always developing a temporary negative reaction. After each solution I tried for some time to deny its effect with an aggravation of the corresponding symptom. It is known that children generally behave in this way in the face of any prohibition. When they are scolded, for example, for an intolerable noise they are making, they repeat it one more time before ceasing, thus appearing to have ceased of their own free will after having rebelled against the prohibition. Under the influence of the German tutor, a new and better sublimation of his sadism developed, which had by then come to predominate over masochism, as befitted the approach of puberty. The subject began to be passionate about the military career, about uniforms, weapons, and horses, and fed continuous daytime dreams with such ideas. In this way, through the influence of that man, he came to free himself from his passive attitudes and set out on almost normal paths. As an echo of his adherence to his tutor, who was not long in separating from him, he was left with a preference for everything German, doctors, establishments, and women, over that of his homeland, representation of the father, a circumstance that considerably facilitated the transfer in the cure. From the time before his liberation by the German preceptor belongs a dream that we will cite as having remained forgotten until its appearance in the course of treatment. He had seen himself in it on horseback and chased by a gigantic caterpillar. In this dream the subject recognized an allusion to another belonging to a time long before the arrival of the German professor and which we had already interpreted long before. In this previous dream he had seen the devil, dressed in black, in that same attitude that had so frightened him in The Wolf and the Lion, and pointing at a gigantic snail with his outstretched finger. He soon guessed that the demon belonged to a well-known poem and that the dream itself was an elaboration of a well-known painting depicting the demon in a love scene with a girl. The snail replaced the woman as an exquisitely feminine symbol. Guided by the indicating gesture of the devil, it was easy for us to discover the meaning of the dream. The subject was longing for someone who would provide him with the last teachings that he still needed on the enigma of sexual commerce, as his father had provided him earlier in the primordial scene. The first. The other subsequent dream, in which the feminine symbol had been replaced by the masculine, reminded him of a certain event that had occurred shortly before it. One afternoon, while he was riding a horse around the farm, he passed by a peasant sleeping on the ground and accompanied by a child who must have been his son. The latter woke up his father and said something to him that made him get up and start insulting and chasing our subject, who had to bite the spurs to get rid of him. In addition to this memory, he associated with the dream that on the same farm there were trees that were completely white because they were riddled with caterpillar nests. What the subject actually fled from was the realization of the fantasy that the son slept with his father, and the memory of the white trees was evoked to re-establish a link to the anxiety dream of the white wolves perched in the walnut tree. It was, then, a direct explosion of anguish before that feminine attitude towards men, against which she had first protected herself with religious sublimation and soon had to protect herself, much more effectively still, with military sublimation. but it would be a serious mistake to assume that after the cessation of the obsessional symptoms no permanent effect of the obsessional neurosis remained. The process had led to a victory for religious faith over critical and investigative rebellion and had been premised on the repression of homosexual attitudes. Lasting damage resulted from both factors. Intellectual activity was severely damaged after this first major defeat. The subject no longer showed any desire to learn, nor did he show that insight with which earlier, at the early age of 5, he had analyzed religious doctrines. The repression of the predominant homosexuality that occurred during the dream of anxiety reserved that most important impulse for the unconscious, thus preserving its original final orientation, and removed it from all the sublimations to which it ordinarily lends itself. Thus, the patient lacked all the social interests that give content to life. Only when the psychoanalytic cure achieved the suppression of such chaining of homosexuality could the situation improve, and it was very interesting to experiment with the subject without any direct warning from the doctor how each fragment released from the homosexual libido sought a job in life and an adherence to the great collective tasks of humanity. 7. Anal eroticism and the castration complex. I must ask my readers to remember the fact that this history of a childhood neurosis constitutes, so to speak, a byproduct obtained in the course of the analysis of a disease suffered by the subject in his adulthood. We therefore had to rebuild with even smaller fragments than are generally offered for synthesis. This task, not excessively difficult by the way, finds a natural limit when it comes to concentrating a multidimensional product on the level of description. I must be content, therefore, with presenting unconnected fragments that the reader can later adjust, forming with them a unitary and harmonious whole. The described obsessive neurosis was born, as we have already stated several times, in the field of a sadistic anal constitution. Up to now, we have only dealt with one of its main factors, sadism, and its transformations, leaving aside everything related to anal eroticism, with the intention, which we now fulfill, of bringing it together in a joint exhibition. Analysts unanimously share, and for a long time, the opinion that the multiple instinctive impulses gathered under the name of anal eroticism integrate extremely importance for the conformation of the sexual life and of the psychic activity in general. They also agree that one of the most important manifestations of transformed eroticism from this source is offered to us in the personal appreciation of money, the valuable material that in the course of life has attracted to itself the psychic interest originally oriented towards the excrement, that is, towards the product of the anal zone. We have become accustomed to referring to excremental pleasure, the interest in money, insofar as said interest is of a libidinous and non-rational nature, and to demand that normal men keep their relationship with libidinous influences free. Money and abide in it by rules deduced from reality. Such a relationship had to show serious disorders in our patient during the period of his illness in adulthood, constituting one of the most important causes of his disability. The successive inheritances his father and his uncle had procured him a considerable capital. He attached great value to being known to be rich and was offended when his fortune was doubted. But he did not know how much it amounted to or how much of it he spent or saved. It was very difficult to decide whether to call him a miser or a prodigal, for he sometimes behaved in one way or another, and never in a way that might indicate a consistent purpose. Due to certain singular traits, which we will explain later, he could have been taken for a vain rich man who saw in his wealth the greatest merit of his personality and always put money before sentiment. But, on the other hand, he did not estimate others in proportion to his wealth, and on many occasions he was rather modest, generous, and compassionate. It was therefore evident that the money had been withdrawn from his conscious disposal and meant something different to him. We have already stated on another occasion that the way in which he had consoled himself for the loss of his sister, who in recent years had become his best comrade, seemed very strange to us, thinking that her death prevented him from having to leave with her inheritance from their parents. Perhaps more singular was the serenity with which he recognized it as such, as if he did not realize the pettiness that such a confession revealed. The analysis rehabilitated him, showing that the pain for his sister's death had been displaced, but this made it even more incomprehensible that he would have wanted to find compensation in the increase in his fortune. He himself found his behavior in another case enigmatic. On the death of his father, the family fortune was divided between him and his mother. The mother administered to him, and the subject himself recognized that he complied with his financial requests with irreproachable generosity. However, any conversation between them about money matters ended with violent reproaches on his part, in which he accused his mother of not loving him, of intending to save at his expense, and of wishing him dead in order to dispose of all the money independently. On these occasions, the mother tearfully proclaimed her disinterest until her son was ashamed, and quite rightly claimed never to have really thought such things of her, but was certain to repeat the same scene the next time. The fact that the excrement must have had the meaning of money for him long before the analysis is clear from a whole series of incidents, two of which we will present here. In a period in which his bowels were still completely oblivious to his sufferings, he visited a cousin of his, who lived closely together, one day in a big city. After his visit, he reproached himself for not having taken care of procuring some money for that relative of his until then, and immediately suffered the biggest squeeze of his life. 2 years later he really began to pass an income to that cousin of his. Another time, when he was 18 years old, and when he was preparing for the maturity exam, he went to visit one of his fellow students to take, according to him, those precautions that his fear of failing, Dirkfall, advised them to do. They decided, therefore, to bribe the beadle in charge of supervising the candidates, and the part with which our patient contributed to the necessary sum was, naturally, the largest. Back home, he thought that he would gladly give even more money as long as he didn't miss any nonsense in the exam, and, indeed, before he got to the door of his house, something different slipped out. It will not surprise us to discover that in his later illness he suffered from very tenacious intestinal disorders, although subject to oscillations, depending on various circumstances. When he came to my office, he had become accustomed to the irrigations, which were performed on him by one of his servants, and he would spend whole months without a single spontaneous defecation, except when he experienced a certain excitement, which he had the virtue of restoring for a few moments. Days the normality of his intestinal activity. He mainly complained that the world was shown to him wrapped in a veil or that he was separated from the world by a veil. And this veil was torn only at the moment when the irrigation made him discharge his bowels, after which he felt good and healthy again. The specialist to whom I sent the patient for an opinion on the state of his intestine had sufficient insight to declare that his disorders were due to functional or perhaps psychological causes, and to refrain from all energetic medication. But no medication or regimen brought the slightest relief. During the years of analytic treatment, the subject did not manage to pass a single spontaneous stool, aside from those caused by those sudden influences mentioned above, but fortunately he allowed himself to be convinced that any intense medication of that organ would worsen his condition, and he was content to achieve a bowel movement or two a week by means of irrigations or laxatives. In this discussion of our patient's intestinal disorders I have given his pathological state in adulthood a larger place than I have hitherto given it in the discussion of his childhood neurosis. And I have done so for two reasons: firstly, because the intestinal symptoms corresponding to the infantile neurosis continued, with little change, in the later illness, and secondly, because these intestinal symptoms played a major role at the end of the treatment. We already know the importance of doubt for the doctor who analyzes an obsessive neurosis. It constitutes the patient's strongest weapon and the preferred means of resistance. Thanks to this doubt, he was able to get our patient entrenched in a respectful indifference. That all the therapeutic efforts would slide for whole years on him. He felt no relief, and there was no way to convince him. Finally, I discovered how important intestinal disorders were for my purposes. They represented, in effect, that part of hysteria that we regularly find at the bottom of all obsessional neuroses. I promised the subject the total restoration of his intestinal activity. I made his incredulity stand out in full light with such a promise, and then I had the satisfaction of seeing his doubts vanish when the intestine began to intervene in our work, and ended up recovering in the course of a few weeks its normal function, for so long lost time. We will now return to the patient's childhood, and within it, to a period in which excrement could not yet have the significance of money for him. The subject had begun to suffer from intestinal disorders at a very early age, and especially the most frequent and most normal in children, incontinence. But we are undoubtedly right in rejecting any pathological explanation for these earlier events, and seeing in them only a demonstration of the purpose of not allowing them to hinder or impede the achievement of pleasure, linked to the excremental function. Until long after the beginning of his later illness the patient retained that intense indulgence in jokes and anal images, which generally corresponds to the natural rudeness of some social classes. During the time when he was entrusted to the care of the English governess, it happened several times that he and the maid had to share the bedroom of that hated woman. The maid then observed with clear understanding that precisely on those nights the child soiled his bed, an accident that no longer happened to him. And it is that on such occasions the child did not consider it shameful, but as a manifestation of rebellion against the governess. A year later, when he was 4.5 years old, that is, during the period of fear, one day he soiled his pants, and this time he was intensely ashamed, to the point that while he was cleaning himself, he exclaimed, with a painful accent, that it was impossible for him to live like this. We must therefore deduce that in the interval a change had taken effect in him, on the track of which his sorrowful lamentation puts us. It turned out that that sad phrase had been heard before by someone else. On one occasion his mother had taken him with her to the railway station, accompanying the doctor who had come to examine her. On the way she had complained of her pains and her bleeding, and had uttered those very words, "It is impossible for me to live like this," without the slightest suspicion that the child, whom she was holding by the hand, had to keep them in her closet. Memory. Therefore, that lament, which the subject had to repeat innumerable times in his subsequent illness, signified an identification with his mother. The patient did not take long to remember an intermediate element, the lack of which was noted between the two events reported, both chronologically and as for the content. At the beginning of her period of fear, her mother had repeatedly warned everyone in the house of the need to observe due precautions lest the children fall ill with dysentery, a disease of which there were many cases in the vicinity of the estate. The boy asked what disease that was, and when he was told that in dysentery blood came out with the stool, he was very frightened and stated that this was happening to him. Had fear of dying of dysentery, but careful examination of his droppings convinced him that he had been mistaken and had nothing to fear. In such fear he wanted to impose identification with the mother, whose hemorrhages the child had learned from his conversation with the doctor. In his subsequent identification attempt, at 4.5 years, the detail of the blood was missing, and thus the subject no longer understood his intense reaction to the incident and attributed it to shame, not knowing that his true motivation was the fear of death, which was expressed, however, clearly in his lamentation. The sick mother feared at that time both for herself and for her children, and it is very likely that the child's fear was based not only on his own motives, but also on his identification with his mother. Now, what could such an identification mean? Between the daring use of incontinence, at the age of 3.5, and the fright that it caused him at 4.5 years, the dream developed, with which his period of fear began, and which gave him an understanding after the fact of the scene lived 1.5 years, and the explanation of the role corresponding to the woman in the sexual act. It is not at all risky to relate to this great transformation that of his behavior regarding the act of defecating. Dysentery was surely for him the disease of which he had heard his mother complain and with which it was impossible to live. Thus, for him, his mother suffered from an intestinal and not a genital ailment. Under the influence of the primordial scene, he deduced that his mother had become ill because of what his father had done to her, and his fear of bleeding when he defecated, that is, of being as sick as his mother, was the rejection of his identification with his mother. Mother in that sexual scene, the same revulsion with which he had awakened from his dream. But the anguish was also proof that in the subsequent elaboration of the primordial scene he had replaced his mother, envying her that relationship with his father. The organ in which the identification with the woman and, therefore, the passive homosexual attitude towards the man could be manifested was the anal area. The functional disorders of this zone had thus acquired the significance of female erotic impulses, and they retained it during the subsequent illness. At this point we must attend to an objection, the discussion of which can contribute considerably to explaining the situation, apparently confused. The hypothesis has been imposed on us that during his dream the subject understood that the woman was castrated, having a wound instead of a virile member, which was used for sexual commerce, and thus castration being an indispensable condition of femininity, and we have assumed also that this threat of losing his penis had led him to repress his feminine attitude toward men, waking up with fear from his homosexual reveries. How does this interpretation of the sexual commerce, this recognition of the existence of the vagina, fit in with the choice of the intestine for identification with the woman? Could not the intestinal symptoms rest on the conception, probably previous and completely opposed to the fear of castration, that the end of the intestine was the place of sexual commerce? There is, of course, the contradiction indicated, and the two opposing theories are irreconcilable. But the question is only whether they really need to be compatible. Our strangeness comes from the fact that we are always inclined to treat unconscious mental processes in the same way as conscious ones, forgetting the profound diversity of both psychic systems. When the agitated expectation of the Christmas Eve dream arose in him, the observed, or constructed, image of coitus between his parents, the old interpretation of sexual intercourse surely arose first, according to which the place that received the penis was the end of the intestine. What else could he have believed when he was a spectator of that scene at the age of a year and a half? But then came the new events, which occurred at the age of 4. The experiences corresponding to the interval and the indications about the possibility of castration awoke and cast doubt on the theory of the cloaca, bringing him closer to the discovery of the difference between the sexes and the sexual role of women. But the subject behaved in this like all children when they are given an unwanted explanation, sexual or not. He rejected the new in our case for reasons related to fear of castration and kept the old. She decided for the intestine and against the vagina in the same way and for reasons similar to how she later had to take sides against God and in favor of her father. The new explanation was rejected and the old theory maintained, which then provided the material for that identification with women, which later arose in the form of fear of dying of intestinal disease and early religious concerns about whether Christ had had a behind, etc. On the other hand, it would be wrong to believe that the new discovery remained ineffective. On the contrary, it developed an extraordinarily intense effect, becoming a reason for keeping the dream process repressed and excluded from any further conscious elaboration. But with this its effectiveness was exhausted and it no longer exerted any influence on the decision of the sexual problem. It was of course a contradiction that after that moment the fear of castration still subsisted, alongside the identification with the woman through the intestine, but it is only a logical contradiction, which does not mean much in this area. The whole process is rather characteristic of the way of working of the unconscious. A repression is something very different from a condemnatory trial. When we study the genesis of wolf phobia, we investigate the effects of the new conception of the sexual act. Now that we investigate disorders of intestinal activity, we find ourselves in the realm of the old cloaca theory. The 2 points of view remain separated by a stadium of repression. The female attitude towards the man, rejected by repression, takes refuge in the intestinal symptoms and manifests itself in the frequent constipation, diarrhea, and stomach aches of childhood. Further sexual fantasies, already based on exact sexual knowledge, can thus already manifest themselves in a regressive way as intestinal disorders. But we do not understand them until we discover the change of significance experienced by excrement after the first days of childhood. In a previous passage I silenced a fragment of the content of the primary scene, which I am now going to expose. the boy finally interrupted his parents' coitus with a bowel movement, which could justify his crying. In support of this addition, the same arguments can be made that we previously presented in the discussion of the remaining content of the scene. The patient accepted this final act constructed by me and seemed to confirm it with passing symptoms. Instead, I had to withdraw another addition, consisting of assuming that the father, annoyed by the interruption, had given free expression to his anger, since the analysis material showed no reaction to it. That last added detail cannot naturally be placed on the same plane as the remaining content of the scene. It is not a question in him of an external impression, whose return is to be expected in a multitude of subsequent signs, but of a personal reaction of the child. Its absence or its subsequent inclusion in the process of the scene would not entail any modification of the whole. And his interpretation does not offer any doubt, means an excitement of the anal area, in the broadest sense. In other similar cases one such observation of the sexual intercourse had to end with the act of urination, and an adult would in the same circumstance experience an erection. The fact that our infantile subject produced a stool as a sign of his sexual arousal must be considered as a character of his congenital sexual constitution. He immediately takes a passive attitude, showing himself more inclined to a later identification with the woman than with the man. In these circumstances, the subject uses the intestinal content as children always do in one of its first and most primitive meanings. The excrement is the first gift, the first proof of the child's affection, a part of his own body, from which he separates in favor of a loved one. Its use as a sign of rebellion, as in the case of our subject at the age of 3½ and against the English governess, is only the negative transformation of that previous signification of a gift. The grumismrti, which thieves sometimes leave at the scene of the crime, seems to combine both meanings, mockery and compensation, expressed in a regressive way. Whenever a higher stage is reached, the lower one can continue to be used in a negative and lowered sense. Repression finds its expression in the antithesis. In a later stage of sexual evolution, the excrement acquires the significance of the child. The child is delivered through the anus, like excrement. The gift significance of excrement easily allows this transformation. In common language, children are also considered a gift, and women frequently say having given a child to her husband, but the usages in the unconscious also take into account the other aspect of this relationship, according to which the woman has received a son as a gift from the man. The money significance of excrement also starts in another direction from its gift significance. That early memory, concealing our patient, according to which he had produced a first fit of anger for not having received sufficient gifts on Christmas Eve, now reveals its deepest meaning. What she missed was sexual satisfaction, which she still interpreted in an anal sense. His sexual investigation was oriented in this direction before the dream, and he had understood during the dream process that the sexual act solved the enigma of the origin of the children. Even before his dream he disliked small children. Once on his way he had found a bird, still featherless, fallen from the nest, and had fled, disgusted and fearful, believing it to be a human creature. The analysis showed that all the small animals, caterpillars, or insects, against which he made bitter war, had for him the significance of small children. His relationship with his older sister had given him the opportunity to reflect at length on the relationships of older children with the little ones, and the maid's statement that his mother loved him so much because he was the youngest had given him a perfectly understandable reason for wanting not to be succeeded by another younger child. Under the influence of the dream that presented him with the coitus of his parents, his fear of such a possibility experienced a revival. Thus, we will have to add to the sexual currents that we already know a new one, emanating, like the others, from the primordial scene, reproduced in the dream. In the identification with the woman, with the mother, he is ready to give his father a child, and he feels jealous of his mother, who has already done it, and perhaps will do it again. By a detour, which goes through the common starting point of the signification of a gift, money can now be incorporated into the signification of the child and thus become an expression of the Female, homosexual, satisfaction. This process developed in our patient when he met his sister in a German sanatorium and saw that his father handed him 2 banknotes. This fact aroused the subject's jealousy, who in his fantasy had always suspected his father's relations with his sister, and as soon as he was left alone with her, he demanded that she hand over his share of that money, and this with such violence and such reproaches, that the sister began to cry and gave him the whole. But it had not been only the real money that had excited him, but even more the child that it meant, that is, the anal sexual satisfaction, received from the father. Consequently, his petty thoughts at the death of his sister really only meant this: I am now the only son, and my father can love no one but me. But the homosexual background of this reflection, absolutely capable of conscience, was so intolerable that it had to be disguised as greed, to the great relief of the subject. The same thing happened when, after his father died, he addressed the subject to his mother those unfair reproaches that he preferred money to his own son, and deceived him for him. His old jealousy that she loved another child more than him, and the possibility that she might have another child, forced him to level accusations at her, the injustice of which he himself recognized. This analysis of the significance of the excrement explains to us that the obsessive ideas, which linked God with the feces, meant something more than the blasphemous offense that he saw in them. Rather, they were authentic results of a compromise process, in which an affectionate and respectful current participated, on the one hand, and a hostile and insulting current, on the other. In the obsessive association, God faces the negatively lowered former meaning of gift merged with the meaning of child, later developed in her. In the last one, a feminine tenderness is expressed, a willingness to give up his virility, in exchange for being able to be loved as a woman. This is precisely that impulse hostile to God, expressed in unequivocal words in the delusional system of the paranoid Schreiber. When we later present the latest solutions to our patient's symptoms, it will be demonstrated once again how his intestinal disorders had been placed at the service of the homosexual current and had expressed his feminine attitude towards his father. A new meaning of the excrement will now open the way for us towards the investigation of the castration complex. By exciting the erogenous intestinal mucosa, the fecal mass plays the role of an active organ, behaving like the penis with respect to the vaginal mucosa, and constitutes as an antecedent of it in the cloaca era. For its part, the excretion of intestinal content in favor of another person, out of affection for her, constitutes the prototype of castration, being the first case of giving up a part of one's own body in order to win the favor of a loved one. Narcissistic love for one's own penis is therefore not without a contribution from anal eroticism. The excrement, the child, and the penis thus form a unit, an unconscious concept sit venia verb, that of the little separable from the body. Through these paths of connection, displacements and intensifications of the libido charge can develop, very important for pathology, and that the analysis discovers. The initial position of our patient regarding the problem of castration is already known to us. He rejected it and remained in the point of view of trading by the anus. When we say that he rejected her, we mean that he did not want to know anything about her in the sense of repression. Such an attitude did not imply any judgment on its existence, but it was equivalent to making it non-existent. Now, this position could not be the definitive one, not even during the years of his childhood neurosis. Later we did indeed find evidence that the subject came to recognize castration as a fact. On this point, too, he had to conduct himself according to that trait. Characteristic of his personality, how difficult it is for us to present his case. He had resisted at first and then given in, but none of these reactions had suppressed the other, and in the end 2 antithetical currents coexisted in him, one of which rejected castration, while the other was ready to admit it, consoling itself with femininity as compensation. And also the third, the oldest and most profound, which had limited itself to rejecting castration without passing any judgment on its reality, could still be activated. Elsewhere I have related a hallucination of this same patient that he had at the age of 5, to which I will add a brief comment here. When I was 5 years old, I played in the garden, next to my nanny, carving a little knife in the bark of one of those walnut trees, which also played a role in my dream. Suddenly I observed, with a terrible shock, that the little finger of my hand, right or left, had been cut in such a way that it only remained attached by the skin. I felt no pain, but I did feel terrible fear. Not daring to say anything to the nursemaid, who was only a few feet from me, I collapsed on the nearest bench and sat there, unable to look at my finger. Finally, I calmed down, looked at my finger and saw that there was no injury on it. We know that at the age of 4.5, and after becoming acquainted with sacred history, that intense mental labor began in him, which culminated in his obsessive devotion. We can therefore assume that the hallucination described developed in the period in which the subject decided to recognize the reality of castration, perhaps constituting the externalization of that decisive step. Also, the small rectification of the patient has some interest. The fact that he hallucinated the same fearful event that Tasso makes his hero Tancredo experience in Jerusalem liberated justifies the interpretation that the tree was also a woman for the little patient. Thus, he played the role of the father, and related his mother's hemorrhages with the castration of women, with the wound he had confirmed. The stimulus for this hallucination came from a story, according to which a relative of his had been born with 6 toes, and his parents had immediately chopped off the extra toes with an axe. Thus, women did not have a penis because it was cut off at birth. In this way, the subject accepted at the time of the obsessional neurosis what he had already ascertained during the dream process, and then rejected by means of repression. Nor could circumcision, the ritual of Christ, as in general of all Jews, be unknown to him after reading sacred history and his conversations about it. There is no doubt that his father became for him at this time that feared person, who threatens to carry out the castration. The cruel God, with whom the child was fighting at that time, who made men fall into sin to punish them later, and sacrificed his son and the children of men, projected his character onto the father, whom, moreover, the subject tried to defend against that God. The child had to fill out a phylogenetic scheme here, and he succeeded, although his personal experiences do not seem to prove it. The castration threats experienced by him had originated more from feminine people, but this circumstance could not delay the final result for long. After all, it was the father of the one who feared castration, thus defeating at this point the phylogenetic inheritance of accidental experience. In the prehistory of humanity it had to be. Surely the father who applied castration as punishment, mitigating it later, until leaving it reduced to circumcision. The more extensive the repression of his sexuality became in the course of the obsessional neurosis, the more natural it would be for him to attribute such evil purposes to the father, the true representative of sexual activity. The identification of the father with the castrator acquired considerable importance as a source of unconscious hostility, carried to the point of the desire for his death, and of feelings of guilt, arising in reaction to it. In all this, his conduct was normal, that is, identical to that of all neurotics possessed by a positive Oedipus complex. What was singular then was the coexistence of an antithetical current, in which the father was rather the castrated one, and as such he inspired deep compassion. In the analysis of the respiratory ceremonial, which was imposed on him in the sight of disabled or miserable people, we have been able to show that the symptom also referred to his father, who had inspired him with pity when he went to visit him at the sanatorium. The analysis allowed us to pursue this process even further back. At a very early time, probably before the seduction, there was a poor day laborer on the farm, in charge of bringing the water up to the house. This individual could not speak, and it was said that it was because his tongue had been cut out, although it is likely that he was a deaf-mute. The little boy loved him very much and pitied him with all his heart, and when that poor laborer died, he looked for him in heaven. This was, then, the first invalid he felt sorry for, but, furthermore, according to the context in which it appeared included and the moment of its appearance in the analysis, it must also have been a substitution of the father. The analysis linked to him the memory of other servants who had been nice to him, and of those he remembered who were sick or Jewish, circumcision. Also the servant who helped clean him up when he soiled his pants at 4.5 years old was a Jew, who was consumptive, and for whom he felt great compassion. All these individuals belonged to the period before his visit to the father in the sanitarium, that is, prior to the production of symptoms, that is, to the respiratory ceremonial, intended rather to avoid identification with the people who are sympathized with. The analysis then turned suddenly, on the occasion of a dream, towards prehistoric times, making him establish the affirmation that in the coitus of the primordial scene he had observed the disappearance of the penis, feeling sorry for the father for this, and being happy to see it reappear. Thus, a new affective impulse, born from this scene. The narcissistic origin of compassion is clearly shown here. 8. Complements of the primordial period and solution. It happens in many analyses that as we approach the end, new mnemonic material, carefully hidden until then, suddenly emerges. Or else that the subject indifferently launches an apparently trivial observation to which is then added something that arouses the doctor's attention until he makes him recognize in that insignificant fragment of memory the key to the most important enigmas embedded in the patient's neurosis. At the beginning of the analysis, my patient had related a memory from the time when his fits of anger ended in attacks of anxiety. Said memory was that of having chased a butterfly with large wings with yellow stripes and ending in pointed ledges, until, suddenly, seeing it perched in a flower, a terrible fear of that little animal had invaded him and he had fled from him crying and screaming. This memory recurred repeatedly in the analysis, demanding an explanation that it had not received for a long time. We had to assume in advance that such a detail had not been preserved by itself in the memory, but represented, as a cover memory, something more important with which it was connected in some way. The patient explained one day that in his language the word for butterfly babushka also meant mother, and that, in general, he had always seen women and girls in butterflies and boys in insects and caterpillars. So, in that scary scene, he must have awakened the memory of a woman. For my part, I proposed the possibility that the yellow stripes on the butterfly's wings might have reminded him of a specific woman's outfit, a totally wrong solution, as will be seen later, but one that I do not want to silence, to demonstrate with an example how little in general, the doctor's initiative contributes to the solution of the problems raised, thus making it totally unfair to hold his fantasy and the suggestion he exerted on the patient responsible for the results of the analysis. Regarding something completely different and many months later, the patient observed that what had inspired his fear had been the movement of the butterfly opening and closing its wings when it was perched on the flower. Such a movement would have been like that of a woman opening her legs, forming with them the figure of a V, that is, that of a 5 in Roman numerals, an allusion to the time when, from her childhood years and still today, she used to be attacked by a bout of depression. This was an idea that I would never have fallen for, and all the more valuable because the association process integrated into it presented an absolutely childish character. In fact, I have frequently observed that the attention of children is more easily captured by movement than by forms at rest, and that child subjects very often base associations on such movements that we adults do not establish. For some time no allusion to this little problem arose again. We will record only the hypothesis that the pointed projections of the butterfly's wings could have had the significance of genital symbols. After some time, a kind of timid and imprecise memory arose in the subject that before the maid there must have been another nanny in the house, who loved him very much and whose name coincided with his mother's. Surely, the child reciprocated his affection, thus dealing with a lost first love. We did not take long to suspect together that the person of that first nurse must be linked to something that later had acquired considerable importance. Subsequently the subject rectified this memory. That nanny could not have been named after her mother, but the fact that she mistakenly believed so proved that in her memory she had merged her with her. His real name had now come up in his memory by a roundabout way. He had suddenly remembered a room on the top floor of the first farm, in which the picked fruit was stored, and among it a certain class of very large, excellent tasting pears with yellow stripes on the skin. In their language the word for pear is gruska, and gruska was also the name of that nursemaid. It was thus clearly demonstrated that behind the concealing memory of the chaste butterfly was hidden that of the nanny. But the yellow stripes did not belong to her dress, but to the shell of the pear that bore her name. Now then, where could the fear that appeared when his memory was activated come from? The closest hypothesis would have been that the child would have observed in she for the first time the movement of the legs that she had described, referring to the V, the sign of the number 5 in Roman writing, a movement that makes the genitals accessible. But, for our part, we prefer to avoid this hypothesis and wait for the appearance of new material. It did not take long, indeed, for the memory of a scene to emerge, very incomplete, but very precise. Gruska was kneeling on the ground, with a bucket full of water and a brush of vine shoots by her side, and she was teasing or scolding the boy. The data obtained in the course of the analysis allowed us to cover the gaps that this memory presented. At the beginning of the treatment, the subject had told me about one of his obsessive crushes, the object of which had been that same peasant girl who, at the age of 18, had infected him with the disease, *385, in which we were to see the incidental cause of his later neurosis. In this first period of the analysis, he had singularly resisted communicating the name of that woman, a resistance that was all the more surprising since it appeared isolated, since the subject was generally docile to the fundamental analytic precepts. But as for this detail, he limited himself to affirming that he was ashamed to communicate said name, because it was so exclusively typical of the lower classes, that no distinguished girl was called that. That name, which I ended up finding out, was Matrona's. She had, then, a maternal sense. The embarrassment his evocation caused the subject was clearly misplaced. The very fact that his crushes were always aimed at girls of the lower classes did not embarrass him, and only that name did. If the affair with Matrona integrated some common element with the scene in which Gruska appeared washing up, the subject's shame could refer to this other previous event. Note 385. On another occasion the patient had said that the story of Juan Hus had made a great impression on him, paying special attention to the bundles of branches that the people added to the pyre where they were to be burned. Now, sympathy for Hus arouses in us a certain suspicion, since we have frequently encountered it in juvenile patients and have always found the same explanation for it. One such patient had even composed a drama, the plot of which was the life and death of John Hus, having begun writing it the very day he had taken from him the woman he secretly loved. Burning makes Hus, like others who suffered the same torture, a favorite hero for those who suffered from neuroses in their childhood. Our patient linked the vine shoots from Hus's fire with the brush the nanny used to scrub. All this material made it possible to easily fill in the gaps in the memory of the scene with Gruska. Seeing the girl scrubbing the floor, the subject had begun to urinate in front of her, who then addressed him, surely in jest, a threat of castration. I don't know if readers have already guessed the reason that prompted me to describe this childhood episode in such detail. It establishes, in effect, a very important link between the primal scene and the subsequent erotic obsession that became so decisive for the destinies of the subject, also introducing an erotic condition that explains said obsession. Seeing the girl scrubbing on the floor kneeling and in a position that made her buttocks stand out, he found in her again the position adopted by his mother in the scene of intercourse. In this way, the girl became her mother, and the activation of that image past aroused in him a sexual excitement that led him to behave with the maid as in the primary scene the father, whose activity the child could not have understood at that time more than as urination. His act of urinating on the ground was, then, really an attempt at seduction, and the girl responded to him with a castration threat, as if she had understood it that way. The obsession emanating from the primal scene was transferred to the scene with Gruska and he continued to act thanks to the new impulse received in it. But the erotic condition underwent a modification that testifies to the influence of the second scene, since it was transferred from the woman's position to her activity in it. This modification becomes evident to us, for example, in the incident with Matrona. The subject was walking through the town belonging to the farm, the second one, and saw a peasant girl on the edge of a pond who was washing kneeling on a stone, immediately falling in love with her with unrestrained violence, although he had not even been able to see her face yet. Her posture and activity had made her take Gruska's place. We now understand how the shame, concomitant with the content of the scene with Gruska, could then be linked to the name of Matrona. Another attack of love, suffered by the subject in previous years, shows even more clearly the coercive influence of the scene with Gruska. A peasant girl who served in the house had long since aroused his liking, but the subject had always managed to control himself, until one day he felt deeply in love when he saw her scrubbing the floor, with the bucket of water and the broom by her side, like that other girl from his childhood. Even his very definitive choice of object, so important for his later life, is shown, by certain intimate circumstances that it is impossible for us to detail here, dependent on the same erotic condition, that is, as a ramification of the obsession that dominated his love choice, starting from the primal scene and through the scene with Gruska. We have already observed in another place the tendency of our patient to lower his love objects, and we have seen in her a reaction against the burden of her sister's superiority. But we also promised at that time to show that this motive had not been the only determining factor, but that it concealed a deeper determination for purely erotic reasons. The memory of the nanny scrubbing the floor, and lowered like that, at least in terms of posture, revealed such motivation to us. All subsequent erotic objects were substitutions for the latter, of which chance had in turn made a first substitution for the mother. The patient's first occurrence of the problem of fear of the butterfly is revealed to us a posteriori as a distant allusion to the primordial scene, 5 o'clock. The connection of the Gruska scene with the threat of castration was confirmed by a singularly significant dream, the interpretation of which was found by the patient himself. He said, in effect, "I dreamed that a man ripped off the wings of an esp." "To an esp?" asked Dash. "What do you mean by this?" "Yeah, to that insect that has a body with yellow stripes, and whose stings are very painful." It has to be an allusion to Gruska, to the wasp, with yellow stripes. "A wasp, you mean?" "Oh. Is it called wasp? I thought the name was just esp." The subject took advantage, like many others, of his ignorance of my language to cover up his symptomatic actions. "But then that esp is me, SP, *386, his initials." The esp is naturally a mutilated wasp, and the dream thus clearly shows that the subject is taking revenge on Gruska for his castration threat. The act performed by the 2.5-year-old in the scene with Gruska is the first visible effect of the primordial scene, us. It presents the subject as a reproduction of his father and reveals to us an evolutionary tendency, oriented in that direction, which later on will deserve the qualification of masculine. But seduction reduces him to a passivity, already prepared in any case by his behavior as a spectator of the sexual intercourse between his parents. In this period of treatment we experienced the impression that the resolution of the scene with Gruska, that is, of the first experience that the subject could remember and had remembered without my expecting or helping him, marked the favorable end of the cure. Because from that moment all resistance disappeared, and our task was reduced to gathering data and adjusting it. Note 386. The old traumatic theory, based on impressions from psychoanalytic therapy, suddenly proved itself valid again. Out of sheer critical interest, I tried once more to impose on the patient a different and more admissible interpretation of his story. According to her, the reality of the scene with Gruska could not be doubted, but such a scene would mean nothing by itself and would have been identified ex post facto by regression by the events of her choice of object, which would have been transferred from her sister to the maids under the influence of her tendency to debase the erotic object. On the other hand, the observation of intercourse would only have been a fantasy constructed in later years and whose historical nodule had been the fact of having witnessed an irrigation or even having been the object of it himself. Some of my readers will probably think that it was only with this hypothesis that I really came close to understanding the case. But the patient looked at me astonished and with a certain contempt when I presented such an interpretation to him, and he did not react to it again. For my part, I have already presented in previous pages my own arguments against such a rationalization. Now, the scene with Gruska does not contain only the decisive conditions of the patient's choice of object, thus preserving us from the error of assigning an excessive value to the significance of the tendency to lower women. It also integrates a justification of my previous behavior by resisting seeing the only possible solution in a reference from the primordial scene to the observation of animal intercourse made by the subject shortly before his dream. The scene with Gruska had emerged spontaneously in the patient's memory, without any intervention on my part. The fear of the yellow butterfly, which we have referred to, showed that it had had an important content, or, at least, that it had been possible to ascribe such importance to its content a posteriori. Such important content was missing from the subject's reminiscence, but it could be discovered and integrated into it, completing it through the associations that the patient linked to it and the conclusions that we deduced from them. It then turned out that the fear of the butterfly was totally analogous to the fear of the wolf, being in both cases a fear of castration, referred first to the person who had been the first to utter the corresponding threat and then transferred to that other to whom it was to be linked according to the phylogenetic prototype. The scene with Gruska had taken place when the subject was 2.5 years old, and, on the other hand, that other one in which he had been afraid of the yellow butterfly was surely after the dream of anguish. It was not difficult to understand that the subsequent recognition of the possibility of castration had developed the anxiety a posteriori, taking it from the scene with Gruska, but this scene itself contained nothing repulsive or implausible, only trivial details of which there was no reason to doubt. Nothing invited us, then, to reduce it to a child's fantasy, nor does it seem possible to do so. The question now arises as to whether we can see evidence of sexual arousal in the act of urinating carried out by the boy in front of the girl who was scrubbing the floor on her knees. Such excitement would then testify to the influence of a previous impression that could be both the reality of the primordial scene and an observation of an animal coitus performed before the age of 2.5. Or was the situation described completely innocent and completely accidental because of the child's urination, the scene having been subsequently sexualized in his memory after having recognized other similar situations as very important? On this point I dare not draw any conclusion. I must make it clear that I already consider it a high merit of psychoanalysis to have been able to ask such questions. But I cannot deny that the scene with Gruska, the role that corresponded to it in the analysis and the effects that emanated from it on the subject's life can only be satisfactorily explained by admitting the reality of the primordial scene, which, for other purposes, they do not matter so much to consider as a fantasy. In addition, such a scene does not integrate anything impossible, and the hypothesis of its reality is perfectly reconcilable with the stimulating influence of the observations made on the animals, to which the apparent cattle dogs in the dream allude. From this unsatisfactory conclusion we will move on to another question that we have already examined in our introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. We would like to know if the primal scene was a fantasy or a real experience, but the example of other similar cases shows us that, ultimately, such a decision is not important at all. The scenes of observation of coitus between parents, of seduction in childhood and threats of castration are undoubtedly an inherited heritage, a phylogenetic heritage, but they can also constitute a property acquired through personal experience. In our case, the seduction of the patient by his older sister was an indisputable reality. Why shouldn't the observation of coitus between their parents also be? We see, then, in the primordial history of neurosis that the child resorts to this phylogenetic experience when his own personal experience is not enough. He fills in the gaps in individual truth with prehistoric truth and substitutes his own experience for that of his ancestors. In recognizing this phylogenetic heritage, I am in perfect agreement with Jung, Psychology of Unconscious Processes, 1917, a work that could no longer have any influence on my introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, but I think it is wrong, from the point of view of method, to resort to phylogeny before having exhausted the possibilities of ontogeny. I don't see why one wants to deny childhood prehistory a significance that is gladly granted to the ancestry of the subject. There is no doubt that phylogenetic motifs and products themselves require an explanation that individual childhood can provide in a whole series of cases. Finally, it does not surprise me that the conversation of the same conditions organically reborn in the individual what these conditions created in previous times and has then been transmitted hereditarily as a disposition to their new acquisition. In the interval between the primal scene and the seduction, between the year and a half and 3 years and 3 months, we still have to interpolate the mute laborer who was for the subject a substitution of the father, like Gruska a substitution of the mother. I believe it is unjustified to speak here of a tendency to debasement, although we find both elements of the parental couple represented by servants. The child overcomes social differences, which still mean very little to him, and places those of lower status who also show affection on the same plane as his parents. Nor does this tendency intervene at all in what refers to the replacement of parents by animals, since the child does not yet have to feel their inferiority. An obscure indication of a phase in which the subject did not want to eat more than sweets, to the point that he feared for his health, also belongs to the same period. They then told him the story of an uncle of his who had also refused to eat and had died very young of sheer weakness, and they also revealed to him that at 3 months of age he had been so ill, with pneumonia, that they had already made a shroud for him. In this way they succeeded in frightening him until he again consented to eat, and in the years after his childhood he even exaggerated his food intake to protect himself against death. The fear of death, which he had been made to feel for his own good at the time, later appeared again when his mother tried to protect him from dysentery and later provoked an attack of obsessional neurosis. We are going to try to discover its origins and its significance in later times. In our opinion, the refusal to eat integrates the significance of a first attack of neurosis, so that this disturbance, the phobia of the wolf and obsessive devotion, would form the complete series of childhood diseases that produce the disposition to neurotic collapse in the children. Years after puberty. It will be objected to me that there are very few children who do not go through a period of lack of appetite or zoophobia. But this argument is not very useful. I am prepared to say that every adult neurosis is based on a childhood neurosis that has not been intense enough to attract the attention of its relatives and to be recognized as such. The theoretical importance of infantile neuroses for the conception of diseases that we treat as neuroses and want to derive exclusively from the influences of later life is strengthened by such an objection. If our patient had not shown, in addition to his lack of appetite and his zoophobia, his obsessive devotion, his story would not differ much from that of other humans, and we would still lack extremely valuable materials that can prevent such easy mistakes from now on. As serious. The analysis would be unsatisfactory if it did not provide us with an understanding of that lament in which the patient synthesized his sufferings. It was that the world appeared to him wrapped in a veil, and our psychoanalytic experience rejects the possibility that such words lack meaning, having been chosen by chance. Such a veil was only torn apart in one situation, that is, when the intestinal contents came out through the anus with the help of an irrigation. The subject then felt good and healthy again and saw the world clearly again for a short time. The interpretation of this veil was as arduous as that of the fear of the butterfly, all the more so since the subject did not hold this representation fixedly, but replaced it with an indefinite feeling of darkness or darkness and other equally elusive things. Only shortly before the end of the cure did he remember having heard that he had been born covered, *387. He considered himself, therefore, a particularly lucky being, to whom nothing bad could happen, a confidence that only left him when he contracted gonorrhea and had to recognize himself vulnerable. That serious offense inflicted on his narcissism caused his collapse and his fall into neurosis. With this he repeated a mechanism that had already developed in him once. His wolf phobia had also arisen when faced with the possibility of castration, to which he later equated gonorrhea. The good luck cap with which he had been born was thus the veil that hid the world from him and hid him from the world. His lament is, in reality, the fulfillment of an optional fantasy that shows him return to the maternal cloister, that is, the optional fantasy of fleeing from the world. Its translation would be the following: I am so unhappy in life, that I have to take refuge back in the womb. But what can the facts mean that this symbolic veil, which had once been real, was torn at the moment of deposition, achieved with the aid of an irrigation, and that his disease ceased under such a condition? The analysis allows us to answer the following: when the veil of his birth is torn, the subject returns to see the world and is thus born again. The excrement is the child in which the subject is born, for the second time, to a better life. Such, then, would be the fantasy of the new birth to which Jung has drawn attention and to which he attributes predominant importance in the optional life of neurotics. Note 387. All this would be fine if it were enough. But certain details of the situation and the need for a link with the particular history of the patient force us to continue the interpretation. The condition of the new birth is that the irrigation be administered by another man, who was later forced by necessity to substitute himself, and this condition can only mean that the subject has identified with his mother, that the auxiliary plays the role of the father, and that the irrigation repeats the copulation whose fruit is the deposition, the excremental child, that is, the patient himself. The fantasy of the new birth appears, then, intimately linked with the condition of sexual satisfaction by man. The translation would now be as follows: only when he is given to replace the woman, that is, his mother, to make himself satisfied by the father and give him a son is his illness disappearing. Consequently, the fantasy of the new marriage was only, in this case, a mutilated and censored reproduction of the optional homosexual fantasy. Examining the situation more carefully, we observe that the patient does nothing but repeat in this condition of his healing the situation of the primordial scene. At that time he wanted to replace the mother, and as we already supposed before, he produced, in the same scene, the child excremental, being still fixed on that scene, decisive for his sexual life, and whose return in the dream of the wolves marked the beginning of his illness. The tearing of the veil is analogous to opening the eyes and opening the window. The primordial scene has been transformed into a condition of his healing. What his lament represents and what is represented by its exception can be fused into a unit that then reveals its full meaning. The subject wishes to return to the womb, but not only to be born again later, but to be reached there, at the time of coitus, by his father, to receive satisfaction from him and give him a son. Being born by the father, as at first he supposed, to be sexually satisfied by him and give him a son, at the cost of the latter, of his virility and expressed in the language of anal eroticism, with these desires the circle of fixation on the father is closed and homosexuality finds its supreme and most intimate expression. I think that this example also sheds light on the meaning and origin of the fantasies of returning to the womb and being born again. The first is frequently born, as in our case, from attachment to the father. The subject wishes to be in the maternal womb to replace the mother in intercourse and take her place as regards the father. The fantasy of the new birth is probably always an attenuation, a euphemism, so to speak, of the fantasy of incestuous intercourse with the mother, or, to use the term proposed by H. Silberer, an anagogic shorthand for it. The subject wishes to return to the situation during which he was in the mother's genitals, a desire in which the man identifies with his own penis and allows himself to be represented by it. At this point both fantasies are revealed to us as antitheses in which the desire for intercourse with the father or mother will be expressed, depending on the masculine or feminine attitude of the corresponding subject. The possibility cannot be rejected that lamentation and in the cured condition of our patient both fantasies and, therefore, both incestuous desires appear together. I want to try, once again, to interpret the latest results of the analysis in accordance with the theories of our opponents. The patient mourns his escape from the world in a typical fantasy of returning to the womb and sees only a possibility of healing in a new birth, expressing this in anal symptoms. correlatively to its predominant disposition. Conforming to the prototype of the anal fantasy of the new birth, he has constructed a childish scene that repeats his desires with archaic symbolic expressive means. His symptoms are then linked together as if they emanated from such a primordial scene. He had to decide on all this regression because life presented him with a task for which he was too indolent to solve, or because he had sufficient reasons to distrust his inferiority and believed that he would find maximum protection through such manipulations. All this would be very well if the unfortunate man had not already had a dream at the age of 4 with which his neurosis began, which was stimulated by the tale of the tailor and the wolf, and whose interpretation makes necessary the hypothesis of such a primal scene. Faced with these facts, small but unassailable, unfortunately, the facilities that Jung's and Adler's theories try to provide us crash. In the given situation, the fantasy of the new birth seems to me to constitute a derivation of the primal scene, instead of being, conversely, such a scene a reflection of that fantasy. Perhaps we can also suppose that the patient was at that time, 4 years after his arrival in the world, too young to already wish for a new birth. But I think it more prudent to withdraw this last argument, since my own observations show that until now children have been estimated very low and that we do not yet know what they are capable of. 9. Synthesis and problems. I do not know if my readers will have managed to form, with the exposition developed up to this point from the analysis of this case, a clear idea of the genesis and evolution of my patient's disease. I'm afraid it wasn't. But, although in general I do not usually defend my expository part, in this case I have to allege extenuating circumstances. The description of such early and profound phases of mental life constitutes a task never undertaken until now, and in my opinion it is better to carry it out imperfectly than not to flee before it, a flight that would also bring with it certain dangers. It is better, therefore, to bravely demonstrate that the awareness of our inferiorities has not been enough to separate us from such arduous work. On the other hand, the case was not particularly favorable. The possibility of studying the child through the adult, to which we owe the richness of data on childhood, had to be extinguished with an unpleasant fragmentation of the analysis and the consequent imperfections of the exposition. The patient's idiosyncrasy and the character traits that he owed to his nationality, different from ours, made empathy very difficult, and the contrast between his affable and docile personality, of acute intelligence and elevated thinking, and his instinctive life, completely untamed, imposed a long preparatory and educational work on us that made it difficult to see the whole. But the patient is totally irresponsible for that character of the case that had to pose the most arduous problems to his exposition. We have managed to differentiate between conscious and unconscious mental processes in adult psychology and clearly describe both species. On the other hand, in the case of the child, it is. Such a distinction is extremely difficult, being almost impossible to differentiate the conscious from the unconscious. Processes that have come to predominate and that, due to their subsequent behavior, must be considered equivalent to the conscious ones, have never been so in the child, however. It is not difficult to understand why. The conscious has not yet acquired all its characteristics in the child, it is in full development and does not yet have the capacity to materialize in verbal representations. The confusion that we regularly make ourselves guilty of between the phenomenon of appearing in consciousness as perception and belonging to a supposed psychic system that we could determine in any conventional way, but which we have decided to also call consciousness, the CC system, is absolutely innocent in the psychological description of the adult, but it can lead us to serious errors when it comes to child psychology. Neither did the introduction of the system. Preconscious does not help us here, since the preconscious system of the child does not necessarily coincide with that of the adult. We will have, then, to be satisfied with a clear realization of the darkness that reigns in this field. Undoubtedly, a case like the one we are describing here could provide a pretext for discussing all the results and problems of psychoanalysis, but this would constitute endless and absolutely unjustified work. We have to tell ourselves that a single case cannot provide us with all the desired knowledge and solutions, and we will have to content ourselves with using it in those aspects that it most clearly shows us. In general, the explanatory work of psychoanalysis is quite limited. The only thing that has to explain are the symptoms, discovering their genesis, because as regards the psychic mechanisms and the instinctive processes, to which we are thus led, it will not be an attempt to explain them, but to describe them. In order to draw new generalities from the conclusions on these last 2 points, many cases like the present one are necessary, correctly and deeply analyzed. And it is not easy to find them, since each one of them represents the work of many years. Progress can only be made very slowly in this area. The temptation to be content with scratch slightly the psychic surface of a certain number of subjects and replace the remaining work with speculation placed under the sign of any philosophical doctrine. In favor of this procedure, practical needs may be claimed, but scientific needs are not satisfied by any surrogate. I am going to attempt a synthetic review of my patient's sexual evolution, starting from the earliest indications. The first thing we find out about him is the disturbance of his appetite, which we interpret, relying on other cases, but with the utmost reservations, as the result of a process of a sexual nature. The first apprehensible sexual organization is, for us, that which we have described as oral or cannibal, and in which sexual arousal is still based on the feeding instinct. We do not expect to find direct manifestations of this kind, but we do expect to find indications of them in the disturbances that eventually arise. The disturbance of the feeding instinct, which of course can also have other causes, then shows us that the organism has not been able to master sexual arousal. The sexual end of this phase could not be more than cannibalism, the ingestion of food. In our patient, such an end externalizes, by regression from a higher phase, the fear of being devoured by the wolf. We had to translate this fear into serving her father as a sexual object. It is known that later years in the case of girls, at the time of puberty or shortly after, there is a neurosis that expresses sexual revulsion through anorexia, and must therefore be related to this oral phase of sexual life. At the culminating point of the loving paroxysm, I would eat you. And in the affectionate treatment with small children, in which the adult behaves also like a child, the erotic end of the oral organization arises again. We have already put forward on another occasion the hypothesis that our patient's father used to make such humorous threats to his son, playing with him at being the wolf or a dog that was going to devour him. The patient confirmed the suspicion with his unique behavior during the transfer. How many times did he recoil in the face of the difficulties of the cure, taking refuge in the transference? He threatened with decoration, and then with all kinds of mistreatment, which was only an expression of affection. The uses of language have taken the sexuality of certain cries from this oral phase and thus describe an erotic object as appetizing or a loved one as sweet. We will remember here that our little patient did not want to eat anything but sweet things. Sweets and chocolates usually represent in the dream caresses conducive to sexual satisfaction. It seems that this phase also corresponds, naturally in case of disturbance, an anguish that appears as fear of death and can adhere to everything that is shown to the child as appropriate. In our patient it was used to overcome his anorexia and even to supercompensate it. The fact that the observation of her parents' copulation, from which so many later effects had to flow, preceded the period of anorexia, reveals its possible source. We can perhaps suppose that I accelerate the processes of sexual maturation and thus develop direct effects, although inapparent. I also know, of course, that it is possible to explain the symptom picture of this period fear of the wolf and anorexia in another, simpler way without resorting to sexuality or a pregenital stage of organization. Anyone who sees no inconvenience in ignoring the signs of neurosis and the continuity of phenomena would undoubtedly prefer such an explanation, and we can do nothing to avoid it. It is very difficult to reach any convincing conclusion about these beginnings of sexual life by means other than the indirect ones used by us. Gruskus scene, at 2.5 years old, shows us our infantile patient at the beginning of an evolution that can be described as normal, with the sole exception of its precocity, identification with the father and urethral eroticism representing masculinity. He is completely under the influence of the primal scene. Until now we have attributed to the identification with the father a narcissistic character, but taking into account the content of the primary scene, we must recognize that it already corresponds to the stage of genital organization. The male genital has begun to play its role and continues to do so under the influence of the seduction by the sister. But we experience the impression that seduction not only propels evolution, but also disturbs and disorients it, giving it a passive sexual end, irreconcilable basically with the action of the male genitalia. Faced with the first external obstacle, that is, the threat of castration of the girl, at 3.5 years, the genital organization collapses, still insecure, and returns, by regression, to the previous stage of the sadistic anal organization, which in another case it might have passed with signs as slight as in other children. The sadistic anal organization is easy to recognize as a continuation of the oral. The violent muscular activity regarding the object that characterizes it has its raison d'etre as a preparatory act for ingestion, which then disappears as a sexual end. The preparatory act becomes an independent end. The novelty with respect to the previous stage consists essentially in the fact that the passive organ, separated from the oral area, develops in the anal area. From here to certain biological parallels or to the theory of pregenital human organizations as residues of devices that are still preserved in some zoological species, there is no more than one step. The constitution of investigative instinct for the synthesis of its components is also from this stage. Anal eroticism is not clearly noted here. Under the influence of sadism, the excrement has exchanged its affectionate significance for an offensive significance. In the transformation of sadism into masochism, a feeling of guilt intervenes that indicates evolutionary processes developed in spheres other than sexual. Seduction prolongs its influence by maintaining the passivity of the sexual end. It now transforms a large part of sadism into masochism, its passive antithesis. It is doubtful whether the passivity can be attributed entirely to her, since the reaction of the 1.5-year-old to observation of coitus was already passive. Sexual coexistence manifested itself in a disposition in which we must also distinguish, in any case, an active element. Along with masochism, which dominates his sexual flow and manifests itself in fantasy, sadism continues to subsist, which is unloaded in the cruelties of which the subject makes victims to animals. His sexual investigation began from seduction and dealt essentially with two problems: the origin of the children and the possibility of castration, intertwining with the manifestations of their instincts and directing their sadistic tendencies towards small animals, as representatives of small children. We have carried the description up to the vicinity of the subject's 4th birthday, the date on which the dream of the wolves activates the observation of parental intercourse carried out at 1.5 years and causes it to develop its effects a posteriori. The processes that develop from this moment are partly beyond our comprehension, and it is not possible for us to describe them satisfactorily either. The activation of the image that now, in a more advanced stage of intellectual evolution, can already be understood, acts as a recent event, but also as a new trauma, as an alien intervention analogous to seduction. The interrupted genital organization is continued again, but the progress made in sleep cannot be preserved. It happens rather that a process comparable only to a repression determines the rejection of the new discoveries and their substitution by a phobia. The sadistic anal organization subsists, then, also in the now initiated phase of zoophobia, mixing with it phenomena of anxiety. The child continues his sadistic activity at the same time as his masochistic activity but reacts with anxiety to a part of them. The transformation of sadism into its antithesis probably made further progress in this period. From the analysis of the dream of anxiety we deduce that the repression is linked to the discovery of castration. The new is rejected because its admission would mean the loss of the penis. A closer reflection makes us discover the following: what is repressed is the homosexual attitude in the genital sense, which had been formed under the influence of the discovery. But such an attitude remains preserved for the unconscious, constituting an isolated and deeper layer. The motive for this repression seems to be the narcissistic virility of the genitalia, which promotes a conflict prepared a long time ago, with the passivity of the homosexual sexual end. Repression is, therefore, a result of masculinity. We would perhaps be inclined to modify from this starting point a whole part of psychoanalytic theory. It seems, indeed, evident that it is the conflict between masculine and feminine tendencies, that is, bisexuality, which engenders repression and the production of neurosis. But this deduction is incomplete. One of the two conflicting sexual tendencies is in agreement with the ego, but the other is contrary to narcissistic interest and thus succumbs to repression. Thus, in this case, the ego is also the instance that triggers the repression in favor of one of the sexual tendencies. In other cases there is no such conflict between masculinity and femininity, there being only one sexual tendency, which wants to be admitted, but which runs up against certain powers of the ego, and is therefore rejected. More frequent than the conflicts born within sexuality itself are those that arise between sexuality and the moral tendencies of the self. In our case there is no such moral conflict. The accentuation of bisexuality as a reason for repression would therefore be insufficient, and, on the other hand, that of the conflict between the self and the libido explains all the processes. To the theory of male protest, as developed by Adler, one may object that repression does not always side with masculinity against femininity. For in a whole series of cases it is masculinity that is subjected to repression by the commandment of the self. Furthermore, a careful investigation of the process of repression in our case would deny that narcissistic masculinity was the only motive. The homosexual attitude born during sleep is so intense that the ego of the little subject fails to dominate it and defends itself against it through repression, aided only by the narcissistic masculinity of the genital. Just to avoid misinterpretations, we will state that all narcissistic tendencies start from the ego and remain in it, and that the repressions are directed on libidinous object charges. We will now pass from the process of repression, the exhaustive exposition of which we have perhaps not succeeded in, to the state resulting from the dream. If it had really been masculinity that had overcome homosexuality, femininity, during the dream process, we would have to find an active sexual tendency of a frankly masculine character as dominant, but we do not find the slightest trace of it. The essentials of the sexual organization have not undergone any change, and the sadistic anal phase subsists and continues to be the dominant one. The victory of masculinity is shown only in the fact that the subject reacts with anxiety to the passive sexual aims of the predominant organization, masochistic, but not feminine. There is no victorious male sexual tendency, only a passive tendency and a resistance against it. I imagine the difficulties that the precise, unusual but essential distinction between active masculine and passive feminine poses to the reader, and therefore I will spare no repetitions. The post-dream state can therefore be described as follows: the sexual tendencies have been dissociated, in the unconscious the stage of genital organization has been reached and a very intense homosexuality has been constituted. Above it subsists, virtually in the conscious, the previous sadistic and predominantly masochistic sexual tendency, and the ego has completely changed its attitude towards sexuality, is in full sexual revulsion and anguishedly rejects the predominant masochistic aims, as one who reacted to the deepest homosexuals in the genesis of a phobia. Thus, the result of the dream was not so much the victory of a masculine current as the reaction against a feminine current and a passive one. It would be quite forced to ascribe to this reaction the character of masculinity, since the self does not integrate sexual currents, but only the interest of its own preservation and the maintenance of its narcissism. Let us now examine the phobia. It is born at the level of the genital organization and shows the relatively simple mechanism of an anxiety hysteria. The ego protects itself, through the development of anxiety, from what it sees as a powerful danger, that is, from homosexual satisfaction. But the process of a repression leaves behind a clear mark. The object to which the feared sexual end has been attached must make itself represented by another before consciousness, and in this way what becomes conscious is not the fear of the father, but the fear of the wolf. But the production of the phobia is not satisfied with this content alone, since the wolf is later replaced by the lion. With the trends sadistic against small animals, there is a phobia towards them, as representatives of the subject's competitors, that is, of the little brothers that his mother can give him. The genesis of the phobia of the butterfly is especially interesting, constituting a repetition of the mechanism that engendered the wolf phobia in the dream. A chance stimulus activates a past experience, the scene with Gruska, whose threat of castration proves effective a posteriori, whereas when it actually happened it did not make any impression on the subject. It can be said that the anguish that enters into the formation of these phobias is fear of castration. This statement does not contradict the theory that anxiety arose from the repression of the homosexual libido. In both statements we allude to the same process, in which the ego withdraws an amount of libido from the optional homosexual tendencies, which is converted into floating anxiety and is then linked to phobias. Except that in the first statement the motive that drives the ego also appears. A more careful reflection reveals that this first illness of our patient, leaving aside anorexia, is not limited to phobia, but must be considered as a true hysteria, to which, in addition to the symptoms of anxiety, correspond phenomena of conversation. A part of the homosexual tendency is preserved in the corresponding organ, and the intestine is conducted from this moment on, and likewise in later times, as a hysterical organ. Homosexuality, unconscious and repressed, has taken refuge in the intestine. It is precisely this part of hysteria that then renders us the best service in solving the subsequent illness. Nor should we lack determination to attack the even more complicated circumstances of obsessional neurosis. Let's review the situation once more. We have a predominant masochistic sexual current, another repressed homosexual, and an I, dominated by hysterical revulsion. What are the processes that transform this state into that of obsessional neurosis? The transformation does not happen spontaneously, by internal evolution, but is caused by an external influence. Its visible result is that the relationship with the father, which until then had found expression in the wolf phobia, now manifests itself in obsessive devotion. We cannot fail to note that the process taking place in this patient provides us with an unequivocal confirmation of one of the hypotheses included in the totem and taboo on the relationship of the totemic animal with divinity, number 1372. We affirm then that the representation of the divinity did not constitute a development of the totem, but that it arose independently of it and to replace it from the root common to both. The totem would be the first substitution of the father, and the god, in turn, a later substitution, in which the father rediscovered his human figure. This is also what we found in our patient. The wolf phobia goes through the stage of totemic substitution of the father, which is then interrupted, and is replaced, as a result of new relationships between the subject and the father, by a phase of religious fervor. The influence that causes this change is the initiation of the subject in the doctrines of religion and in sacred history, an initiation that achieves the desired educational results. The sadistic masochistic sexual organization is gradually brought to an end, the wolf phobia rapidly disappears, and in place of the fearful rejection of sexuality there arises a higher form of its subjugation. Religious fervor becomes the dominant power in the child's life. But these overcomings are not achieved without a fight, which is expressed in blasphemous ideas and causes an obsessive exaggeration of religious ceremonial. Apart from these phenomena, pathological, we can say that religion has fulfilled in this case what corresponds to it in the education of the individual. He has tamed the sexual tendencies of the subject, providing them with a sublimation and a very firm localization. He has devalued his family relationships, and has thereby put an end to a dangerous isolation, opening the way for him to the great human community. The child, previously wild and frightened, thus became sociable, teachable, and moral. The main engine of religious influence was the identification with the figure of Christ, facilitated by the chance of his birth on Christmas Eve. The love for his father, the exaggeration of which had made repression necessary, finally found here an outlet in an ideal sublimation. Being Christ, the subject could love his Father, who was, therefore, God, with a fervor that, in the case of the earthly father, would not have found a possible release. The ways by which the subject could testify to said love were indicated by religion, and the conscience of guilt did not adhere to them, inseparable from individual erotic tendencies. If the deepest sexual current, already precipitated as unconscious homosexuality, could still be purified, the more superficial masochistic tendency found without great renunciation a sublimation, incomparable in the story of Christ's Passion, that to honor and obey his divine Father had allowed himself to be martyred and sacrificed. Religion thus fulfilled its work in the little stray through a mixture of satisfaction, sublimation, and separation from the sexual through purely spiritual processes, and facilitating him, like every believer, a relationship with the social community. The subject's initial resistance against religion had three different starting points. In the first place, we already know from other examples its characteristic resistance to all novelty. He always defended the whole position of his libido, driven by the fear of the loss that its abandonment would bring with it, and mistrusting the possibility of finding compensation in the new one. This is an important fundamental psychological peculiarity, which I have dealt with in my 3 essays for a theory of sexuality, calling it a capacity for fixation. Jung wanted to make it, under the name of psychic inertia, the main cause of all the failures of neurotics. Wrongly, in my opinion, because it goes much further, and also plays a very important role in the lives of non-neurotic subjects. The mobility or stickiness of energy charges, libidinous or otherwise, are characteristics of many normals and not even of all neurotics. Until now they have not been related to others, thus being like prime numbers, divisible only by themselves. We only know that the mobility of psychic charges singularly decreases with the subject's age, thus providing us with an indication of the limits of psychoanalytic influence. But there are people in whom this psychic plasticity crosses the age limits, and on the other hand, others who lose it at a very early age. In the case of neurotics, we make the unpleasant discovery that, given apparently equal conditions, it is not possible to achieve modifications in some that we have easily achieved in others. So that when considering the conversion of psychic energy we must make use of the concept of entropy with no less reason than with physical energy, which is opposed to the loss of what has already occurred. A second point of attack was provided for him by the fact that the same religious doctrines are not based on an univocal relationship with respect to God the Father, but rather develop under the sign of the ambivalence that presided over their genesis. The subject soon became aware of this ambivalence, discovering that his own, so highly developed, helped him greatly, and he linked to it those penetrating criticisms that we were so astonished to find in a 5-year-old boy. But the most important factor was of course a third, to whose action we had to attribute the pathological results of his struggle against religion. The current that impelled him towards man, and that had to be sublimated by religion, was no longer free, but was partly captured by repression, and with it removed from sublimation and linked to his primitive sexual goal. Thanks to this connection, the repressed part tended to make its way towards the sublimated part or to relax it into itself. The first musings, related to the personality of Christ, already contain the question of whether that sublime Son could also satisfy the sexual relationship with the Father as it was preserved in the unconscious of the subject. The rejection of this tendency had no other result than to give rise to obsessive ideas, apparently blasphemous, in which physical love for God was imposed in the form of a tendency or to lower his divine personality. A violent defensive struggle against these transaction products then had to lead the subject to an obsessive exaggeration of all those activities, in which he had to find devotion, pure love for God, and expulsion drawn up in advance. Finally, religion triumphed, but its instinctive basis proved incomparably stronger than the adhesiveness of its sublimations, for as soon as life provided the subject with a new replacement for the Father, whose influence was directed against religion, religion was abandoned and replaced by something else. Let us still recall the most interesting circumstance that religious fervor arose under the influence of women, the mother and the nanny, and it was, instead, a masculine influence that freed the subject from him. The genesis of obsessional neurosis, on the basis of the sadistic anal sexual organization, completely confirms what we have stated elsewhere, about the disposition to obsessional neurosis. But the pre-existence of intense hysteria makes our case less transparent in this respect. We will close the review of our patient's sexual evolution by throwing some light on its subsequent transformations. With puberty, the normal masculine current arose in him, intensely sexual and with the sexual purpose corresponding to the genital organization, current whose destinies had to govern his life until his later illness. This current linked directly to the scene with Gruska, took from her the character of an obsessive crush and had to fight with the inhibitions, emanating from the residues of childhood neuroses. The subject finally conquered full masculinity with a violent eruption towards the woman. From then on he kept this sexual object, but its possession did not rejoice him, for an intense inclination towards the man, now completely unconscious, and which gathered in itself all the energies of the previous phases, constantly turned him away from the feminine object and forced him at intervals to exaggerate his dependence on her. The woman. During treatment he lamented that he could not resist women, and all our work tended to uncover his unconscious relation to men. His childhood had been characterized by the oscillation between activity and passivity, his puberty, for the hard conquest of masculinity, and the period of his illness, for the conquest of the object of the masculine current. The precipitating cause of his illness does not count among the types of neurotic illness that we have been able to collect as special cases of frustration, thus warning us of the existence of a gap in that series. Subject became ill when an organic genital condition activated his fear of castration, injured his narcissism, and forced him to lose confidence in a personal predilection of fate. He became ill, then, because of a narcissistic frustration. This arrogance of his narcissism harmonized perfectly with the other signs of an inhibited sexual evolution, with the fact that his heterosexual erotic choice did not concentrate in himself, despite all his energy, more than very few currents. Psychic, and with the fact that the homosexual attitude, much closer to narcissism, asserted itself in him with such tenacity as an unconscious power. Naturally, in such disturbances the psychoanalytic cure cannot achieve an instantaneous transformation equivalent to the result of a normal evolution, but only remove obstacles and make accessible the path so that the influences of life can achieve a better oriented evolution. As particularities of his psyche, discovered by the psychoanalytic treatment, but not fully clarified and, therefore, could not be directly influenced, we will point out the following: the aforementioned tenacity of fixation, the extraordinary development of the inclination to ambivalence and, as a third feature of a constitution that we must classify as archaic, the ability to keep the most heterogeneous and contradictory libidinous charges juxtaposed and capable of functioning. A constant oscillation between them, which for a long time seemed to exclude all solution and all progress, dominates the pathological picture of his later illness, of which we can only give brief details here. This was undoubtedly a characteristic feature of his unconscious system, which had extended in him to conscious processes, but the subject showed it only in the results of effective movements, since in the purely logical field he rather revealed a special ability for the discovery of contradictions and antitheses. In this way, his mental life made an impression on us similar to that produced on us by the ancient Egyptian religion, which is incomprehensible to us because it preserves the evolutionary stages together with the final products. We end here what we intended to communicate about this pathological case. Only two of the many problems he suggests seem to me worthy of special mention. The first refers to the congenital phylogenetic elements, which take care, as philosophical categories, of the distribution of impressions of life and are, in my opinion, residues of the history of human civilization. The Oedipus complex, which involves the child's relationship with his parents, is the best known of these schemes. Where the experiences do not adapt to the hereditary scheme, an elaboration of them begins through fantasy, a task that would be very interesting to pursue individually. Precisely these cases are very appropriate to show us the independent existence of the scheme. We can often observe that the scheme achieves victory over individual experience, as happens in our case when the father becomes the castrator and the danger that threatens infantile sexuality, despite the existence of a totally inverse Oedipus complex. The contradictions between the experience and the scheme seem to provide rich material for children's conflicts. The second problem is close to this one, but much more important. Considering the behavior of the 4-year-old boy before the reactivated primary scene and remembering the much simpler reactions of the child of a year and a half, when witnessing said scene, we cannot reject the hypothesis of the performance of a kind of prior knowledge, difficult to determine, similar to a preparation for understanding. It is quite impossible to imagine what this factor may consist of, and we can only compare it to the broader instinctual knowledge of animals. If such an instinctive patrimony also existed in man, we should not be surprised that it refers especially to the processes of sexual life, although it is clear that it should not be limited to them. This instinctive element would be the nodule of the unconscious, a primitive mental activity dethroned and replaced by human reason later acquired, but that it would retain many times, and perhaps in all cases, the power to lower the highest mental processes to their level. The repression would be the return to this instinctive stage. Man would pay with his capacity for neurosis for that great acquisition and would bear witness, with the possibility of neuroses, of the existence of the previous primitive instinctive degree. The importance of early childhood dreams would lie in the fact that they would provide this unconscious with material that would protect it from being suppressed by later evolution. I know that these hypotheses that stress the phylogenetically acquired hereditary factor in mental life have already been repeatedly proposed and that there was even a certain tendency to grant them a place in psychoanalytic research. For my part, they only seem admissible at the moment when psychoanalysis reaches the traces of the hereditary after having penetrated through the strata of the individually acquired. 1923 Addendum, we will gather here the chronology of the events mentioned in this history. Subject is born on Christmas Eve. At a year and a half, malaria. Observation of the coitus of the parents or of that innocent scene in which they were together, and in which the subject later integrated the fantasy of coitus. Shortly before 2.5 years, scene with Gruska. At 2.5 years, concealing memory of the departure of the parents with the sister. He shows him only with the girl and thus denies Gruska and the sister. Before 3 years and 3 months, lamentation of the mother before the doctor. At 3 years and 3 months, beginning of seduction by his sister and, shortly after, threat of castration by the girl. At 3.5 years, the English governess. Beginning of character alteration. At 4 years, dream of the wolves. Genesis of the phobia. At 4.5 years, influence of sacred history. Appearance of obsessive symptoms. Shortly before the age of 5, hallucination of the mutilation of the finger. At 5 years, departure from the first farm. After the age of 6, visit the sick father. At 8 and 10 years, last explosions of obsessive neurosis. At 17, crisis precipitated by gonorrhea. At 23 years, beginning of treatment, February 1910, End of treatment, July 1914. Second treatment, November 1919 to February 1920. Third treatment with Dr. Ruth Mack Brunswick, October 1926 to February 1927. My exposition will have revealed to the reader that the patient was a Russian national. I discharged him, completely cured in my judgment, a few weeks before the unexpected outbreak of the World War, and did not see him again until the hazards of the war opened access to southern Russia for the Central Powers. He then came to Vienna and informed me that immediately after the end of the cure an impulse had arisen in him to free himself from the influence of the doctor. In a few months of work we later managed to master. One last fragment of the transference, not yet overcome. Since then, the patient, who had lost his homeland, his fortune, and all relations with his family in the war, has felt normal and has conducted himself beyond reproach. It is very possible that his misfortune itself has contributed to affirm his recovery, satisfying his feeling of guilt. End. Story of a child neurosis. Case of the Man of the Wolves. Sigmund Freud.